I am from Alaska. I was born into the Togateli tribe in the center of Alaska in 1980. This is about 50 miles south of Fairbanks, in a small town called Nenana. There are several other tribes in the immediate area, and long ago there were far more before Russian and American settlement. I don't want to identify myself on accident, in case anyone from here ends up hearing this, but suffice to say that paranormal experiences are natural and expected as part of my ancestral heritage. As a child, my grandparents told my father strange stories of the Stickmen, who were eaters of men. They especially loved the flesh of children, and newborn babies were considered delicacies by these spirits of the forest. One time when Nenana was first being settled by Gusok, white people, there was a hunter who came from faraway lands to settle the wilderness of Alaska and hunt its bears and moose. He took a small party of hunters and native guides into the forest, deep into the countryside to the marshes, where moose and bear frequented. Far down the Tatana they went, shooting every animal they saw: squirrel, moose, wolf, porcupine. The natives were silent and led the men on, afraid to question their violent, wasteful ways. Until late one evening, the hunter called his party to set up camp and rest. They chose a quiet spot in a field, where they could see all around them in case wolves decided to try and sneak up, and they rolled out their blankets after dinner and went to sleep, leaving some to take turns watching for animals. The hunter had fallen asleep quickly, content on his bed of furs and blankets. He had dreams of sunny days, perfect for hunting the famed grizzly. He was awoken by the sound of cracking sticks. He found this odd, as they were in a field, but perhaps it was the men rekindling the fire. He peeked out of his tent to check on the encampment. Horror of horrors. There were pools of blood on the ground, but no corpses. He watched as a man, bundled tightly in his blankets, was lifted up by what appeared to be many small moving sticks and carried off towards the edge of the camp. The man woke up from the gentle rocking of his convoy and screamed, alerting the remaining hunters in the camp, who jumped up and reached for their guns. They were quick to draw but were confused by what to fire at, as mostly they just saw sticks on the ground moving in ways that were impossible. They decided to run, because there was nothing clear to shoot at. But as they ran together, they were chased by giant animals that appeared suddenly from the tall grass. The hunter waited until the men were being chased by all the animals, then jumped from his tent, and without looking back when he heard their screams, ran as fast as he could. A week later, he showed up in Nenana, crazed, exhausted, and on the edge of death. He related his story and then perished, for he would constantly wake up screaming if he tried to sleep, and thus could not rest. A version of this story is common in my family, though some details change with the storyteller. My father has seen the Stickmen on a hunting trip, and like this apocryphal hunter, he has been crazed and terrorized by the memory ever since. It is said that though the Stickmen go by different names and come to people in different shapes, that there is some regularity to their appearance. They generally come as either sticks, which blend in with trees, or the ground, until you come upon them, or they can visit you as an animal. This animal is usually described as either a large deer or a small moose, which can move incredibly quick for how awkward it seems to be hunched on its legs. They appear as pale or white animals, and though they usually do this to intimidate men and women, they are hungry beings who feast on the unwary. Seeing a stick man, one may be haunted for years or their entire life afterwards, but in some cases it is considered good luck, as if a stick man is uninterested with you, it means that you have powerful ancestors surrounding you. You can usually anticipate the arrival of a stickman, as the entire forest will go quiet around you for as long as they are in the vicinity, and sometimes they will speak to you and to each other. When this happens, they sound like a raspy whisper, mixed with the rattling of dry willow branches, a light chattering. Do not camp where the forest is silent, and do not look into the eyes of the stickmen, for they will drive you mad with fear. I have never seen these spirits personally, at least. I can't be sure. My only experience with one potentially happened outside of Carson City, Nevada. I was driving alone in a big Ford pickup truck late at night when I noticed what originally I took to be a deer on the side of the road. This was no deer. It ran like a dog or cat, staying close to the ground in a liquid motion, whereas a deer would bounce or gallop as they ran. It also moved upwards of 30 miles an hour, and when it turned and ran down the hill, I realized it was much larger than almost any deer I'd ever seen, yet lacked antlers. Please, ask your questions if you have, and feel free to share your own experiences below. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages, following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together. I was out of shape at the time, and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like what I would have done during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey we were on a dirt trail heading uphill, with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit, with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He appeared to be in his late 70s to early 80s, very pale with liver spots dotting his face, and a grey-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that and goes into the woods? The instant thought, seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes in this weather, was that he had lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us as we were for seeing him. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After perhaps a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope that was presumably at a 40-degree angle, spanned for perhaps 50 feet or more, and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given that there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross that so cleanly and quickly. I mean, all that distance is hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he still did not appear to be wet or muddy in the slightest. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting weirded out, as was I. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down this, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said to me, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge at this point, and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to our car and call the emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, and that they would have all the tools they needed. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice has drastically changed. He was practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry schoolboy throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a fully grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets. His skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter of a mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police, so that we could show them where we had encountered him. An hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, and the like. We led them to the exact spot, and then pointed to the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date. This happened to my father-in-law 10 years ago at our hunting camp in Alabama. It popped into my head as we were heading there tomorrow for a few days of deer hunting, and he told me to go ahead and share his story. As some people probably know, we get out an hour or so before light and climb into a tree stand, a ladder leading up to a seat in a tree, usually fairly deep in the woods to hunt. This foggy morning, my father-in-law had been in his stand for a few hours, and it was getting light, and he was reading a book as he waited for something to happen. Out of the fog, he hears a woman's voice, much closer than anyone should have been to him at the time. She's calling, "Hunter, oh Hunter," very sing-songy, like a mother calling her child in for dinner as he played outside. Now, as I said, he is pretty deep in the woods, and there are sticks and dried leaves everywhere. You generally make a pretty good racket getting to your stand, which is why we go out so early. Not only that, but in order to know where he was and spot him camouflaged in a tree, she must have seen his light when he walked out, followed him into the woods and waited hours before calling him. His first thought was that maybe the woman was calling someone called Hunter, perhaps her son. She called again, "Hunter, oh Hunter," and he realized that he is the hunter. So he turns around, peers around the trees, and sees a young woman. She, in very few words and halting speech, explains that something is wrong with her hot water heater and asks if he can come and have a look. Now, the strangeness of the situation hadn't set in yet, and he's a give the shirt off his back kind of guy. Not to mention he's 6'2", nearing 300 pounds and has a gun. So he wasn't too worried about this small woman and starts getting down the tree to go have a look. He follows her back to her mobile home, which borders our hunting land, probably a 10-minute walk away. She walks inside and leaves the door open. He's trailing behind a little, so he gets to the door, kind of knocks, and sticks his head in and says hello. Where he entered is a laundry room, and he can see there in the room is a hot water heater, and water is just pouring out the valve at the bottom, just absolutely pouring onto the floor. He walks over, turns the valve off, sticks his head in the house to say hello, and nothing. No one answers. The house seemed empty. Empty of people anyway, but it was a disaster inside. At this point, he's starting to see how strange it all is, and decides that this is just the sort of situation that could get you robbed or worse, and nopes the hell out of there and hurried back to our cabin. Now, we have hunted in this land for years since, and have never seen anyone at this place, although until this season it has shown obvious signs of being lifted. So every time I pass by her place, which backs up right to the road we take to our hunting stands, I think lady in the trailer with the messed up plumbing, who may or may not have had nefarious intentions for my father-in-law, please, let's never meet. My parents explore abandoned towns and mines as a hobby. When I was younger, I would get dragged along with them, but when I started college, I stopped going with them. However, in those times that I did go with them, I did encounter a lot of things that made me feel uneasy. Of course, I am and always have been a skeptic, so I always just assumed that it was the atmosphere getting to me. But there was one time that I legitimately can't explain what I saw. For context, I live in Arizona, and most of the places we explored were in the northern part of the country. There's quite a few towns in that area that are dying or have already died, and there are plenty of mines that have long since been out of operation. I can't remember where this encounter took place, but I do know my parents wanted to visit it after they saw some paranormal investigation show cover the site of this abandoned mine. My parents aren't exactly paranormal investigators, but they do like visiting and photographing creepy locations, and supposedly haunted locations usually end up having some truly haunting imagery. Getting to this mine was more trouble than any of us expected. The road was so rough that we had to park off to the side and walk a mile or two to even get there. I don't remember if she heard this from anyone in the local town, or if it was mentioned in the TV show, but apparently a few years prior a couple of kids went exploring at the mine and went missing. It was an assumption that the kids probably fell down an open shaft, as they weren't blocked off, and once I got a good look at them myself, they truly looked like bottomless pits. More so than any other creepy place we have visited, I just felt so uncomfortable here. I'm not a particularly violent person, but a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me to push my stepmom down into the mine shaft. After all, she was standing right in front of them with her back turned to me while she was trying to take pictures down it. No matter how much I tried to shake off the idea, I couldn't help but feel like it was in my best interest to just push her down. Once she stepped away from the bottomless pit, the thought went away and I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I've heard that these kind of morbid thoughts aren't too uncommon, especially around ledges, but part of me feels like this was different, even though I can't say I have any proof that it was. I just had this feeling, this overwhelming hatred come over me in those moments that she stood standing in front of it, and a few seconds felt like hours. After she was done taking pictures around that area, she went to go photograph some other areas while my father and I started walking down a path to see if there was anything of interest on the other side. While we were coming around a bend in the path, we saw someone else. It was a man who looked to be in his mid-20s. He was decked out in full mining gear, and although I'm no expert on mining attire, it definitely looked old-fashioned. He gave us a wave and walked off the path towards an empty clearing, where I assume there probably were more open shafts, although I wouldn't know, because my father immediately turned to me and told us we had to leave. I've tried coming up with explanations for who this man was, but there are lots of things that didn't add up. The mine there wasn't operational, so obviously there wouldn't be anyone in full mining gear walking around. I considered for a long time that it could have just been a practical joke of some kind on anyone who went there after seeing the paranormal TV show. However, we saw no vehicles on the way up the rugged road, and we didn't visit this place right after it featured on said TV show. It must have been at least 6 months after, not to mention it's not easy to find. We literally had to hunt down locals and ask them for directions, because Google wasn't helpful in telling us where to go, as the road leading to the mine was unmarked. It's been 7 years, and I still get chills whenever I think about it. This story takes place at the rather infamous Myrtles Plantation. We arrived at the plantation around 2 p.m, and we were given a complimentary tour of the grounds. I got vibes all over the place. It was pretty insane already because I get vibes but rarely do. It was pretty insane already because I rarely get vibes that strong. We were then shown the place that we would be staying the night, and were let in and essentially set free. I did my evaluation on the room, and then afterwards noticed something. Near the back door of the room, I got insane vibes, like stronger than the rest of the grounds. I knew something had happened there, and I knew I had to find out. By this point, it was about 5 p.m, and understandably, we were pretty hungry. We left the plantation to go into town and grab some food. We got back around 6:30 and started to walk over to our cabin when a friendly woman we had seen earlier came over. Knowing we were paranormal enthusiasts, and asked if we wanted to see her room, which was in the actual plantation, as we were staying in a slave cabin. We said of course, and she brought us up to her room. We looked around, and it was pretty regular as far as vibes go, but when I entered the bathroom, I felt the most oppressive and awful atmosphere. It was creepy and terrible, and I hated it, and instantly wanted to leave. I didn't necessarily think something had happened there, but I knew that something inhabited that bathroom, and I knew it wasn't something kind. We didn't stay in that place for long, but it was cool to look at. We left after 10 to 20 minutes of looking around. We went back to our cabin and got settled in for the night. Lots of vibes there, and my sister and I, who were somewhat younger at the time, slept in the same bed because we were scared. She and I stayed up pretty late playing a game called Farkle. It's pretty fun and a good time killer. and as soon as midnight rolled around, we thought it would be best to put the game away and try and get some sleep. But as soon as we had put the game away, and the noise of the game and our voices were gone, I noticed another noise. The rocking chair on the front porch of the cabin was methodically rocking back and forth, and the rocking I heard was hard enough that I was certain there wasn't any wind responsible for it. I got a little bit freaked out, but decided I wasn't going to mention it to my younger sister, as it would probably just trouble her. So she and I laid down to sleep. She fell to sleep quite quickly, but I was having issues falling asleep, with all the thoughts and worries running through my head. But all those seemed rather irrelevant, as I heard footsteps on the stones outside our cabin. Now mind you, our cabin was fenced in, and so it couldn't be entered by anyone who didn't have the key. But regardless, I heard the footsteps, and they continued as I heard light slaps of feet in the wooden porch, along with a groan of the weight, and they continued on forwards, and the noise continued right on through the door, as I heard the figure pass right by my bed, but saw nothing, and then continue out to the back door. I also smelled some rosy scent, which seems to accompany spirits relatively often for some reason. I really had a hard time falling asleep after that. This event must have occurred at 1 a.m, and I didn't fall back into the land of slumber until at least 3:30. When I awoke again, we went into the main house for breakfast, and we heard stories from the other campers about their experiences, which were equally terrifying, including people who felt a presence sit down on their bed in the middle of the night, and a person coming out of a cabin to tell people to be quiet, but the cabin itself was void of noise or people. We ate and shared our stories, returned to our cabin, and sat there for a while playing games on our tablet and just relaxing, as it was a nice cabin despite it being haunted. Then, I can't remember why, but my sister and my mum got into an argument. The argument obviously didn't sit well with whatever spirit occupied the cabin, because their argument was cut short by the faucet in the bathroom turning on full force and then back off again. The three of us freaked out pretty bad, and cleared out the cabin in no less than 30 seconds, and that was how it ended. And I'm never going to forget how scary it was to be awake by myself in the cabin in the middle of nowhere, to suddenly realize that I'm not alone. When I was 13, my mum decided I would be going to military boarding school. It was located north of Mexico in a place called Durango. Durango is known because it is home to many creepy things: drug cartels, the zone of silence, ghost towns, UFO sightings, and the like. I was in that school for around 6 years, and one day a friend invited me and other students to go to his hometown to have some tacos with his dad, a well-known rancher. When we arrived to the town, we were on his house having some drinks, and eventually he decided it was time to go. We hopped into his pickup truck, and he began driving right when the sun was setting. After about half an hour, everything was dark, and he had to turn on the headlights. I was on the front seat with my friend, and we've just arrived to the place. He slowed down his car, and we could hear the nocturnal wildlife and some scratches on the car from branches and plants. The headlights allowed us to see just enough to distinguish shapes. He stopped the car right in front of a little lake, and we could see some bushes and trees around the water. A few meters in front of the right headlight, we could see what we thought was a rock. The guys started unloading the truck while they joked around. My friend and I were still in the front smoking, when all of a sudden he said, "Did you see that?" while he pointed to the rock in front of the car, with the tip of the cigarette. That just moved. Since I've always wanted to see something paranormal, I remained still. We were both looking at this rock when all of a sudden, the thing turned its head to face us with, I thought, what looked like the face of Gollum. Big, round, yellow eyes and arched back. And I turned to my friend. He grabbed his gun and quickly got out of the car and fired 2 shots into the sky. All of this while people are still unloading the truck and making a fire for the grill and such. I heard a few scream. I saw how this creature looked up to the sky, turned around, and hopped into the water. Right after that, everyone began asking, "What happened?" My friend told us that it was actually a common sight. He explained that his father and grandfather often saw the creature when they were hunting. He said that they called it hombre rana, or frogman. Just a few of the guys saw the thing. We still had the tacos and everything. We were a little creeped out, but we assumed that the frogman was probably more scared of us than we were of him. I saw many terrifying, creepy and odd things in Durango, but the frogman takes the cake. I live in rural Australia. One early summer afternoon, I was bushwalking down a big-ass hill, which has a river down at the bottom. From the peak of the hill to the base is about 500 meters. However, the track sort of snakes in back and forth like an S shape, as it's too steep of a hill to just go straight down. About a third of the way down, I spotted a pair of feet from about the ankles down sticking out between some bushes, with the feet running perpendicular to the track. As I got closer, I could see that a man was lying down there, and based on his body position assumed he was resting, and likely homeless and or disoriented, seeking shade from the summer sun, further adding to my theory that he was homeless. He had long hair, a long head, and was wearing track pants, and it was 35 degrees Celsius at least. I got about 100 meters from where I saw the man, and was now on a section of the track, running parallel and below to where he was, now walking in the opposite direction. I had followed a curve on the track S. I saw that this man was suddenly running down. Seeing this unnerved me, as based on his outfit, he did not appear to be a local jogger. As fight or flight began to kick in, I pulled out my inhaler, took a puff, and pretended that I was about to start jogging. I wanted to commit to my act, in case I had judged him wrongly, and he was really a local jogger, albeit a poorly dressed one. He continued to run after me along the track, and I was about 2/3 of the way down when I noticed he was running too hard to merely be a jogger. He was running closer to a sprinting pace than a jog, which, as most people know, is a terrible idea when running downhill, let alone in 35+ degree heat, in track pants, and with no visible water bottle. As he gained ground on me, I decided to sit on my ass and slide down the hill, between sections of the track that ran parallel to one another. Once I finally made it to the bottom and across to the other side of the river, I turned and saw he had stopped running. I continued to walk along the river, when after about 5 steps I heard him yell out something obscene. I continued to run on and off until I made my way back to the nearest road, and am yet to return to that track. I am an 18-year-old male from Namibia, Africa. I experienced this in 2016, along with my older sister and girlfriend. It happened during the school holidays as we took a trip to my grandparents' farm. It was one of the places that we loved going to. One morning after having breakfast, my father informed my sister and I to go make a stop at another farmer's farm. He told us that we were to deliver a few farm tools to him that my granddad had supposedly borrowed. My sister perked up when she heard that we would take the car, since the farm was a few kilometers away. My sister and I decided to let my girlfriend tag along, since she still didn't know my family very well. As we were driving along the gravel road, we joked, talked about small things and other crazy stuff, until we reached a road that had trees on either side of it. The trees grew in such a way that they blocked the sun's rays from reaching the gravel road, so we were basically driving under a large shade. I want to let all of you know that I'm very familiar with this part of the road, and I've driven through it many times before, and nothing strange has ever happened. But on this peculiar day, something was off. The birds that usually sang were quiet. Even the wind seemed to be silenced as we drove. By now, we were all quiet and just listening to the gravel beneath the tires of the car. We passed a large tree that had a white mark on its bark, and I dismissed it as I have seen it many times before, and after a few moments I realized that something wasn't right. I checked the time on the radio and it read 2:07. My eyes immediately went wide. We left our farm at 12:30. It never took us long to reach our neighbor. I was a little confused by this. Then my girlfriend said something from the back seat that confused me even more. "Guys, didn't we pass this tree 5 minutes ago?" I looked up, just in time to see us passing the same large tree with the same white mark on its bark. I knew something wasn't right, and I immediately looked at my sister, and she had a frown on her face that I couldn't exactly interpret. "What the hell?" I said out loud. We drove a little more, and we passed the same tree every time, until my sister got angry, and we came to a stop just a few feet away from the same tree. We got out, and were met with a deafening silence. My girlfriend got spooked, got closer to me, and I put an arm around her. "Okay, what the hell is going on around here?" my sister said. "I don't know. We should have been at the guy's farm by now." "We drove past this tree 20 times, my girlfriend said. "I'm no stranger to the paranormal. I've had weird experiences before, but nothing ever like this." I was incredibly freaked out, to say the least. As we got into the car again, we saw a red pickup truck drive slowly past us. My sister immediately started the car and closely followed the pickup truck. We drove through the wooded area just a few feet behind it, and after moments, we realized that the environment started to change. I sighed in relief as I saw the dam that was on the right side of the road. We were all glad we got out of there safely. I don't know if this was a loop or a glitch, but it was definitely paranormal. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I know what I experienced that day. We all did. We got home safely without any incident, but we never told our family or anyone else what happened. We have all heard stories of the area of the road being haunted, but I never believed them. After experiencing this, however, I can safely say that my point of view on the matter has changed. I am an avid urban explorer, and in December a friend and I drove to a location about 45 minutes away from home. It was in a small town in Pennsylvania. To get to the abandoned house, and more or less crumbling house, we had to drive on a one-lane road through a forest. When we entered that road, there was a dead deer lying on the side of the road. Not uncommon, but it would be later on. Then her GPS malfunctioned and told us to return to the route, even though we were already on it. The arrow was pointing in the opposite direction we were going, away from the forest. We kept driving anyway and turned into the parking lot. There were only a few cars. There's a walking trail in the forest that people use to bike and run. We go to the structure, an old water tower, and take some pictures, and opt to walk on the trail. We're both feeling really off, like there was a secret that everyone on the path knew except for us. We were the only ones on the path, and we were walking and making small talk, when we heard a bike bell behind us. We turn around, and a woman goes ahead of us on her bike, and then stops to tie her shoe. We keep walking and my friend says, "Look at her bike, there's no bell on it." So we have no idea where the bell came from. There were only about 4 cars in the parking lot, but we ended up passing over 30 people. They all stared at us too, never breaking eye contact. Then my friend pointed out something, a boulder that had a stream of water trickling down it, but there wasn't a source or a crack. It was just starting from the middle of the rock. Again, it was weird. We kept walking down the trail, and I stopped and pointed into the forest. There was a tall black figure standing far by the trees. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any clothes or even a face. We were looking at it, when there was a loud snapping noise right behind us, like a tree branch. We turned around quickly, but there weren't any sticks or branches on the ground at all. When we looked back in the direction of the figure, it was gone, all in about 5 seconds. The entire time we felt drowsy and off, so we decided that we were going to walk back to the car and leave. There was no one else there, and no cars in the parking lot. We drove back through the forest road. We were only out there for about an hour, and when we got to the intersection that brought us out to the forest, the deer was still on the side of the road, except it was entirely bones. Just a skeleton, not even bloody. It was completely clean. All that was left was the head, which was still on the skeleton. Nothing could have eaten or skinned it that fast, especially not without leaving any fur or blood. At this point we were freaked out enough and just wanted to go home. And then her trunk opened. There's a certain button on the car that you have to press, and her hands weren't even near it. She got out the car to close it, and all of the doors in the car clicked and locked on their own, except my passenger door that stayed unlocked. We had service too, but her GPS wouldn't start to work again until we were out of that town. I don't really know what happened, but it felt like something in that place wanted us gone. And every time we pointed out something that was strange, something else would distract us from looking too closely at it. I'd love some closure to this. It still makes me feel uneasy. Sometimes I dream about it, and the same word always comes into the dream. Harvest. I don't know why. A couple of minutes ago I looked up the coordinates to the place, because I had them on my phone but couldn't remember the address. The people wanted to know where this place was, and the first thing to pop up was abandoned paper mills to be demolished on Friday. There was no talk of demolishing the place a month ago. I've spent the last 27 years in rural Colorado, and have had one somewhat recent creepy experience that I can't explain. 3 years ago, I was elk hunting with a couple of co-workers in November. As we got up to our hunting area, several thousand feet in elevation higher than our hometown, we ran into the snow. Enough snow that we couldn't make it to where we had planned on setting up camp. We decided to make do and set up in a pull-off at the mouth of a meadow that was about 100 yards from some early 1900s herder cabins. We spent the night, got up early, and spent the following day trekking through the forest. The next night, we were all three awoken by a blood-curdling tortured sound, screaming from the direction of the cabins. It went on for a few minutes, then cut off abruptly with a bang and the sound of breaking glass. We opened our tent door and shined flashlights towards the cabin, but couldn't see anything. None of us were willing to go off into the forest at night. After several sleepless hours cuddling with my pistol and jumping at every little noise, the sun came up and we investigated. There were no tracks in the snow around the cabin, not even animal tracks. But the cabin closest to us had one of the windows broken out from the inside. All the broken glass was outside the cabin and on top of the snow. The only piece of furniture I could see inside it was a table that was on the side. The door was still securely boarded up. We spent the day picking up camp and moving to a new area, and after 2 more restless nights, I decided to call it and returned home empty-handed. None of us have hunted in that area since. I'm a big outdoorsman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So of course, when I decided to go to college, I had to keep in mind that having some decent woods nearby was a must. Upon checking a couple of places out, I decided to go to Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania, or just the borough. The biggest plus about going to that university is that my Uncle Fred lived up there and was a well-known name in the community. He owns to this day a framing shop right in the middle of the small town area. This was a huge plus, since knowing people like that always equals more land to put spots in. That's all I really needed to pick the college I would be going to. Edinburgh is really cool because there are lots of old buildings and strange, flat landscapes as compared to the hilly land around Pittsburgh. So it was cool to figure out how to scout the game that I'd be going after once the season started. My main hunting area was directly behind my uncle's house. He has a beautiful log cabin that sits back off the road with woods on all sides of it. It was truly a thing of beauty. When he had the house built, he actually had the gigantic chimney made of flat stones that we found in the woods behind the house. As I was scouting the area for the first time, I came up on a few different circles of boulders in the middle of the woods. They were definitely very old. The boulders were quite big, much too big just to be moved there for some reason, like a group of guys came camping out. They must have taken at least 10 men to move, and only if they'd have had some kind of pulley system or something. There were also smaller rocks, and when I say smaller, I'm talking like somewhere around 300 pounds or more, making inner circles inside of the large boulders. I found a total of 7 of these stands throughout the property. Some of the rocks that were now part of the chimney, they simply had to be with the amount of rocks he used on them. Oh, and also these rock circles had made a much larger circle around the woods. After a few more days of scouting with my buddy Brandon, we were sure we had our spot picked out for our first day of archery. We couldn't wait to get out there. Perfect day too. It was great. The thing about Edinburgh is that it gets more snow per year than most of Alaska, due to the lake effect snow coming across Lake Erie. What happens is before the lake freezes completely over, the water, which is warmer than the air, pushes the clouds way up high into the atmosphere, too high for them to actually snow due to the low temperature all the way up there. The clouds then come inland and fall back towards Earth. It takes them about 20 miles to do this, and Edinburgh is about 20 miles from the lake. You see what I'm saying. Anyway, on the first day of archery, which is in the first week of October in Pennsylvania, there was a thin layer of snow. This is perfect for archery, because you can see deer in the woods much more easily, and you can also see if any animal has left any tracks. If they did, they were fresh, since the snow didn't happen too long before that. In our trees for about 2 hours or so, neither of us had seen anything. I had just gotten off the radio with Brandon, who was on the other side of the property, when I see some movement over to my right of the pine thicket. I then see a branch move a little bit, and see 4 deer legs underneath. I readied my bow and my stance, as to make a good clean shot at the deer. Around 15 feet up in a tree, I did this very carefully. About a minute later, as I was looking for any movement, I lost the 4 legs inside the thicket. This was expected due to the fact that where the deer would have been is a common feeding area for them. So I waited. Maybe another minute or so later, I caught movement again. It looked as if the deer would break through the thicket into more open woods. The movement I've been waiting for. As I brought the bow up into a full drawn stance, I was stunned by what I was seeing. Where the deer should have been, there was a man. A strange man at that. This absolutely should not have been. If there was a man anywhere near where that deer had been, the deer would have been long gone, spooked back into the thicket. I put my bow back down onto the hook that I screwed into the tree, and lifted my binoculars to my eyes. At only 35 yards away, I could now see in great detail his physical appearance. He was rather rotund, with his belly leading the way. A white, long-sleeved shirt on with ruffles down the middle, just like the pirate shirt in that one episode of Seinfeld, if any of you have indulged. It was tucked into thick canvas brown pants, with pants being tucked into white socks directly below his knees. Further down where his shoes should be, there was absolutely nothing. He had no feet whatsoever, no calves, no shins, no shoes, and with my eyes wide open I mouthed to myself, "What the hell?" Instead of walking, he seemed to float through the woods, going from right to left. This is when I started noticing other extremely strange things about him. I looked through the binoculars at his head. It was cocked back with his chin resting down on his lower neck. His very large, red, bulbous nose up in the air, a bit of a snobby overall look. The hair, though, it was covered by a wig that judges in England wear. A white wig with 3 curls on the side of it, where his ears would have been. I noticed that he didn't seem to float through the woods. He was floating through the woods. His arms stayed tucked at his sides, unmoving as he traveled. He also never looked down. The way his head was cocked, he could have only been looking upwards. This is not any person or animal, as they'd be constantly looking down and around for obstacles that you might trip over. All of this happened within a period of about 20 seconds. He had come out of the thicket behind a medium-sized oak tree. Then, when he hit the next oak, he never came out from behind it. I watched in absolute astonishment for another 5 seconds, waiting for him to break his cover, so that I could see him again. This never happened. I told Brandon what had just happened, and was immediately made fun of. I expected that was what would be coming through the radio after I got done talking. He was just saying I should have taken a picture of the only deer/human or minotaur remaining in the world. I told him he won't be laughing when the deer tour came over to his tree stand and smacked his ass right out of it. Even though it was in the middle of the hunt, I had to get down and see what the hell just happened. I knew where he would have walked. Not only would I see his footprints in the snow, but it would have also been very easy to see even better tracks due to the fact the area we were in was full of muddy ground. A freaking hummingbird would have left tracks in this muddy mess. As you probably guessed, when I go over to the spot where he had been, there was nothing. I saw not a single track from him, nor deer, nor anything. I was utterly amazed. What happened later that night was just as creepy. So after I was done checking out the muddy snow ground where the man should have left some kind of footprint, I went back to my tree stand and climbed back up to the height that I'd been hunting from earlier. I radioed Brandon and told him I was back up the tree and secure. We always did this as a precaution, in case something happened while we were climbing the tree, or securing the platform of the portable tree stand. My old man's buddy, Bunky, actually saved his left eye from being completely blind and useless. He was practicing shooting from a raised platform when he slipped and fell off, driving a stick right into his eyeball as he hit the ground. This has nothing to do with the story, but all of you hunters out there should adopt this practice. You know, the more you know. Anyway, we're hunting the rest of the day, but not without periodic raging from Brandon, making fun of me and the deer tool throughout the rest of the hunt. I knew I'd be hearing about it for at least a week or longer. That is, of course, if the rest of the night would have been a normal one, which as it turns out, it was not. As twilight approached, I radioed Brandon and told him I was going to start getting out of the tree. Brandon was actually in a built stand that we found while scouting in the months prior, so I had him meet me at my spot due to the fact it was going to take me much longer to get my stand down and off the tree. Just as I thought, Brandon was walking up to my spot, right as I was getting to the bottom of the tree. Once I got all the way to the bottom, I unhooked the straps that were around my feet, jumped down to the ground, and started feverishly explaining to him everything that happened. I took him over to the muddy area to show him that there were absolutely no tracks in the snow or mud. I definitely could sense he didn't completely believe everything I was telling him. I was able to sense this so easily because he looked right at me with his mouth agape and his eyebrows pushing up towards the middle of his forehead and said, "Are you messing with me, brother?" He was also able to tell that I wasn't messing with him when I looked at him in what I'm sure are some of the craziest eyes he's ever seen and said, "Hell no." When he realized I was 100% serious, he started taking inventory of all the things that I had previously told him, and we went back and forth trying to make any kind of sense of what I had witnessed. While we were talking to each other back and forth, we had failed to notice that nighttime was already upon us. It was that Stephen King full dark, no stars kind of night too, due to the fact that we were looking for signs left behind from the ghost guy. We were in a patch of woods that we weren't very familiar with. We may have been pretty close to where my stand was, but once night falls in the woods, it's a whole new ballgame. Still, the patch of woods we were in was enclosed by a triangle of roads. All we had to do was walk in a straight line, and we could come out somewhere on one of the roads, then just walk that road back to my uncle's house. So we began walking. Walking in a straight line in the woods is almost impossible without a compass, which I didn't have. So we were both figuratively and literally in the dark when it came to where we were. A couple of minutes into the walk, we heard a loud scream, as if someone were being murdered. Now I know what every animal in the wood around here sounds like, both normally or in panic mode, making death cries. I see videos often on YouTube of people recording a sound in their backyard that they think is a person who needs help, only to be a rabbit screaming from being attacked by some predator. This was not that at all. After waiting a couple of minutes to see if the screaming would continue, we started walking again in the direction we thought we should be going. We didn't talk much about what we had just heard, probably because of the anxiety we were both feeling. We couldn't ignore it for long though, because we heard another long, blood-curdling scream. It was closer this time, and sounded different. At first we thought it sounded like a woman being attacked. This new scream sounded threatening. Ironically, we felt like we were the ones being stalked and hunted at this point, and we still pushed forwards. After walking another 100 yards or so, we came across something very strange directly in our path. There were these weird, clear, gelatinous masses on the top of leaf litter. Now I'm at 32, which isn't an age that necessarily screams wisdom from my experience, but I've been in the woods since as far back as I can even remember. My old man taught me everything there is to know about the wilderness around us. So take it from me, these clear globs should not have been there. The only thing I could think of was that it was tree sap, but it wasn't. I poked one of the masses with a stick, fearing what they were made of. I had read a story about a town that had clear gelatinous globs rain down on them. A lot of these people got very sick, and if I'm not mistaken, I think even a couple of them perished from it. So needless to say, I was taking precautions. Their consistency was that of a thick gelatin, like if you made jello with only 1 cup of water instead of 2. Once we started walking again, we came across a good amount of this stuff. It wasn't all over the woods. Instead, it was directly in front of us as we walked, almost like something or someone knew which route we would try and take and marked it with these globs. Then came another scream, this time even closer and with a little something added in. This time, not too far away from us, we heard leaves rustling and a couple of twigs snap. Something was definitely there. It could have been a deer, but this was unlikely. Whatever it was wasn't spooked at all, not from us or the threatening scream. It's easy to tell when you've spooked an animal when they start running. On top of that, most of the leaves were still very moist, therefore not making as much noise as they normally would. This sent our anxiety level through the roof. At that point, the only thing that was on our mind was getting the hell out of there. We were no longer curious about floating men, screams, or alien jelly. We just wanted out, which should have been very soon. The distance we walked should have come across a road by now, but we hadn't yet. Stranger still, we couldn't see any houses or street lights, but still we kept going, thinking we'd find our way out very soon. Our flashlights were now beginning to die, so we were definitely in a hurry, which, by the way, is not what you should do if you were ever even lost in the woods. Cool heads always prevail in this situation. As we were walking, we started to see some pine trees. This was very strange, because we had thoroughly scouted the land. The only pine trees were over near my stand where we started. After seeing a few more, we got that foreboding feeling, almost like a sick, anxious panic feeling. We stopped for a minute to check our surroundings and found that the exact spot that we stopped was the same spot we started. We were standing right next to a pine tree, with a dead pine next to it that had a branch broken off and dangling still from the severed limb. How could this be? We had been sure we were walking in a straight line, but that must have been an impossibility, since we made a circle. We had no idea whatsoever how this happened, especially since we were in the exact spot we started from. Also very strange, we had seen my tree stand that was still hanging on the tree. It was very close to us, but when we started to walk out, it was nowhere to be found. We walked over to it and immediately found the trail that we had to take to leave the woods. It led directly back to my uncle's backyard. The trail actually went right past the live pine tree we had been standing under. There is no way we had missed that from the start. To add more to the strangeness, as we walked only about 20 yards down the trail, we see plainly my uncle's light that he had above his garage to illuminate his driveway. Our minds were blown, but at least we were able to get out. On the last 100 yards of the trail, we found more clear gelatin blobs directly down the middle of the pass. This was definitely crazy. They were not there when we walked in. We had both been on the trail when we entered the woods, and we would have seen them for sure. We heard no more screams after the time we heard the rustling of the leaves and the twigs break, but we had a strong feeling of being watched when we were still in the woods, and an even stronger version of the same feeling as we stepped onto my uncle's backyard. This is at the top of my list for scariest experiences in the woods. I've no explanation for any part of it. Not the floating ghost guy, not the screams or the globs, not the getting lost in the woods, and not the circle of boulders. I would love to hear from anyone who has had anything like this happen to them. There has to be some kind of answer, but at this point all I have is my story about what happened that night, and thankfully one other person who went with me through it. At least he's been able to validate what happened to people that don't believe this actually happened to us. Whether you believe it or not is up to you, but I can assure you this, it happened exactly as you heard it. I know it sounds crazy and outlandish, but it happened. And that's a scary thing to think about next time you guys find yourselves in the woods. Something incredible had happened back there. I'm thankful that we were able to get out of the woods without having anything bad happen to us. What it did was made my wanting to understand the paranormal even stronger. One day I'm going to go back there alone and camp for a night or two in the hopes that something happens again, and that I have the strength to seek out whatever it was and get some answers. Earlier this summer, I was hiking in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. A couple of days into my trip, I got really sick. Sore throat, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite, about the worst cocktail of symptoms for hiking any long distance. I had found a tick on me and was terrified I might have Lyme disease. I decided to get off trail and see a doctor, which is easier said than done in the most remote, inaccessible sections of the whole Appalachian Trail. Thankfully, there are old logging roads which crisscross the wilderness, so I decided to turn off onto a road which, I was told, led to a campground. There I hoped to find some day hikers and get a ride into town. As soon as I turned off the Appalachian Trail, it started pouring with rain, which only increased my misery. A few minutes later, I noticed a dog in the woods. Strange, I thought. Then I saw another dog, and another, and another, and about a dozen big hunting hounds fenced off randomly in the middle of nowhere, Maine. They barked at me, slavering, and pawed at the chicken wire fence, which did not seem strong enough to hold them. This was slightly disconcerting, but the brown trouser moment came when I spotted a lone figure in the woods, what seemed to be a tall man in a hooded blue rain jacket and pants. I couldn't see his face, and he just stood there, still as a statue, severely spooked. I hiked out of there on the double. In the backcountry, it's generally good manners to say hello and exchange pleasantries, but this guy didn't say a word. Maybe it was because of the rain. Maybe he was feeding bodies to his hounds out there. I'll never know. But he definitely saw me, and I could tell that he was watching me go past. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night, as my friend and I were quite the night owls. We loved the freedom of almost never seeing another soul on the roads or the paths we frequented. Even when using main roads, it would be very rare to see a car out so late in such a rural area, and you could see and hear them coming from very far away due to their headlights and the noise of the vehicle disrupting the peaceful silence of the night. We were really into it at the time, and would often ride our boards for miles and miles, sometimes not arriving home until the sun was up. One particular night, we decided to ride a few miles away from our usual back roads to take one of our favorite hidden routes. It began with a narrow paved path that was the only piece of land separating two sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long and extremely relaxing to ride through due to the scenery. After making it to the end of the lake, we decided to continue moving and turn into a very close path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up to the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness. We both noticed what appeared to be a tiny moving ball of dim light down there. It moved so strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlight down, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, that small light turned into multiple blinding lights and extremely loud revving sounds, overwhelming our senses that had become accustomed to the dark and silence. Acting purely on fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gaining behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off the path into a very dark, very overgrown hole in the side of a hill, overlooking where we had just come from. We decided to hide in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers ride up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers and 2 on fully sized motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance we had covered. We felt safe enough to whisper very softly to each other and speculate who these people could be. Our first thought was they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one here in the many times we'd been through, and honestly we doubted that this county had the budget or even the desire to have anyone patrol the deep woods at night. Besides that, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were very angry about something. They called out to us for a while, yelling things like, "We know you're out there. We can see you. Come out." We stayed silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of the men yell, "Find them now," and smash a bottle. That had erased any hopes we had that these were just park rangers. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path we came from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside that dugout, watching the lights from the vehicles travel through the woods and paths. One of them already coming full circle and passing the point he started from. I thought about calling for help, but was too afraid to open my phone in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their furthest distance yet, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run somewhere far enough from these people to safely make a call. We ran as hard and fast as we could through the woods. Since their headlights gave away their location on these paths, we could hide again whenever we felt that they were getting too close. Our available hiding spots were getting progressively worse as the woods became less dense, and the fear I felt waiting for one of them to drive past us while basically only being covered in leaves and plants may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, we emerged from the woods onto the intersection of two main roads, far from where we had started. We ducked down into the ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, Connor, who was supposed to meet up with us after our longboard excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was. Luck was with us again. He hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him, and was only a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the two streets we were near the corner of, and explained that we needed to be picked up right away. He agreed, and sped over to us while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men did. We bolted into the back seats of his car, yelling for him to get the hell out of there, and he took off. Relief doesn't begin to describe what I felt being safely driven home after everything I had experienced. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night and decided not to call the police. We figured they would be gone by the time any officer made it out there, and that we would only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law and taking those paths so late at night. I still have no idea what happened or who those people were. I've been told all kinds of theories from friends and family that have heard this story. Some think we walked right up to a huge drug deal. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started and we couldn't see it, our minds both went straight to chainsaw-wielding horror movie serial killer. So I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw. We'll never really know, I suppose. About 10 years ago, I would have been in my early 20s. Me and two of my friends decided one night to head down some train tracks and break into an old abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town. My friend had been there a week before exploring with a buddy, and so we climbed through a hole in the fence they had cut. This place was pitch black, and I had no experience with mining yards, so I could only imagine what these giant looming towers and silos were all around us. I could just barely make out these darker patches that were giant doors and holes in the structure, and hear scuttling noises beyond. These noises could easily be explained as pigeons or bats, so we were not too fazed. We continued to our destination. We knew that our town was surrounded by old World War II forts and bunkers, and there was one on a hill in the middle of the mine yard. As we slowly crept towards our goal, I kept hearing a small tapping noise. Not too alarming, just a small tick, 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 coming from the dark behind us in the direction we had come. We make it to the base of the hill that holds the bunker, and find some way to snake around the only pole light in the yard and up the hill. The whole time, we hear the soft tink, tink, tink behind us. Having made it up the hill and faced with the option to head into the bunker, us brave men decide to pass. Little too creepy for us with no lights to find our way in or out. Instead, we decide to head around back, and this is where things get interesting. We find ourselves standing around a hole with a ladder leading down into a lower level on the bunkers, with that relentless tink, tink, tink coming from somewhere out in the shadows. Now, on two sides of us are the steep drop-offs of the hill. On the other sides are the walls of the bunker. We were boxed in on all sides. with only a small path leading out, and with the hole and ladder in the ground at our feet. So we decide this is a good place as any to light a joint, and so I break it out. With my back to the drop of the hill a few feet behind me, and the hole directly at my feet, I try. I'm on the top of a hill without much cover from the wind, and have a difficult time getting the joint lit, and I'm growing frustrated. Not to mention that the tink 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 is starting to get annoying. Up until this point, I assumed it was a metal sign hanging on the fence we climbed through, gently blowing in the wind, and so ignored it. Frustrated with the joint and getting annoyed with the sound, I turned around and stared in its direction. I asked my friends what they thought it was, and tried again to light the joint, but this time I was facing the noise. I did not try to conceal the flame. As soon as the lighter flashed, the noise changed from a soft tink 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 into a thunderous boom. "Oh shit, security guards," was the first thing to pop into my head. That booming noise is them running down metal stairs in one of the dark towers. They saw my face when the lighter's fire illuminated me, and they must be on their way. All three of us crouch halfway between flight and fight, unsure if we should run, hide, or do nothing. We all decide to wait. It's too dark for them to find us easily, and they're so loud that we'll hear them the minute they get close. Boom! The noise just won't stop, and I swear it's getting louder. How long are those stairs, I think? This is weird. And I swear I hear movement in the grass in the darkness at the bottom of the hill. We all agree it was probably just the wind in the grass, but decide it was time to sneak our way out of this place. Slowly crouching through the dark, we move through the mining yard towards our exit, when we run into a problem. Whatever is making the noise in between us and the exit. We squat down the middle of an open gravel road to try figuring out our next move. Safe in the thought, it was just too dark for anyone to see us sitting there in the dirt. But just to be sure, we picked a spot that placed a large chain link fence between us and that god-awful boom boom boom. Now at this point I decided to upgrade the guards to cops in my mind, and I was becoming a bit antsy, but we decided to wait them out. I guess at this point we all realized that none of this is making any sense. The guards or cops should have reached the bottom of the stairs by now, and that's when it got even weirder. With the boom in front of us and nothing to do but wait if we wanted to use our only known exit, we start to hear something else. In the dark all around us, but somewhere close and on the same gravel we're crouching on, things start to move. There was a thud noise, and then a slow scraping noise as something was dragged across the gravel. Then again from elsewhere, quiet but very close. These noises were all around us, thuds, then a slow dragging across gravel, but we could not really pinpoint in which direction they were coming from. At this point, I go from rational adult to scared kid, and think of all the people who died at this mine, or what could be living in those tunnels. In my mind, the noise went from guards to police, shot past ghost, and is now smack dab in the middle of goblin and giant rat. Of course, we have to get the hell out of there, and decide that climbing the fence behind the mine, running into the woods, and making our way into the highway is our only option. And so we pick our butts up out of the dirt and sneak as fast as we can the hell out of there. We're making it. The noises are now behind us and not getting any closer, and we find rows and rows of empty coal train cars. Perfect. We can walk freely between them with no chance of being spotted from a distance. With the end of the mine yard close by, and with the protection of the train cars, we relax a bit and talk in a less hushed whisper. I guess that was a mistake. A few seconds after entering the rows of train cars, the first car explodes in a boom noise. Whatever was making that booming noise was right behind us, only feet away. I have never in my life, nor I ever, I'm sure, moved so swiftly again. The hundreds of feet between me and the fence to the outside world flew by, and I still do not understand how I got over the 10-foot fence so easily. I just remember leaping off it into the dark. We made it into the road and ahead back to town. The roads bend around the mine, and we could still hear the relentless boom of something smashing that train. My friends got too uncomfortable talking about it and seemed content to forget anything weird ever happened. But my curiosity drives me nuts, and I've gone back there a few times over the years. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened, and the last time I went by myself, everything was torn down and taken away. I live in Russia, and my encounter happened around a year ago in February. I was walking by the embankment at 10 p.m. It was already dark, and nobody was around. There is a road which has 3 levels, a big street. Then it goes down into a smaller one, and finally the embankment, which turns into a small path through thick snow. Just imagine, you're walking through an industrial area which barely has streetlights, no people, and on your left there is a little forest, and on the right there is a river. So I was walking on the path when I saw this man. His whole appearance alarmed me instantly. He had skis on, but was trying to walk as he was without them. In the deep snow, it was around his knee level, and I saw how much effort it took for him not to fall and carry on moving. There was no way to avoid this person, because it was a tiny path through the snow. He was staring at me, smiling. I'm unsure if it was in a predatory way, but something was strange in the smile. I thought, well, if anything happens, I can push him and run, and carry on moving. When I was right next to him, this happened. Everything took place in about 3 seconds. I was watching his every move with my side vision, and in one moment, he vanished. There was nowhere to hide. The trees give you at least 100 meters worth of visibility, and hiding in the snow isn't an option. You would be visible regardless. He was gone. I slightly turned my head to that direction when I captured something right behind me. A stickman. It was absolutely black, around my height, maybe a bit taller. Very thin, with a big head and no neck at all. It was standing in a very threatening position, with its arms set apart like an animal preparing to attack. This figure looked like a picture printed straight onto the air. I thought the 2D object should be material at some point, with the thickness of a sheet of paper, for example. But no, this looked entirely different. I turned my head away and started running to the second level of the road. When I got there, I looked back. This thing was peeking out of a tree, and when I spotted it, it hid behind it. At this point I really thought that I was going to die for sure, and when I got to the 3rd level some cars were driving by, so it calmed me down a little. I looked back. The stickman was standing in the spot where I was a second ago, right in the middle of the road. The whole landscape looked so unreal that at some point I questioned my sanity. This time, I kept the contact and tried to examine the thing. The stickman was slightly moving back and forth, but its whole body had a very stable dark black figure. I got a feeling. The feeling saying that I shouldn't be seeing this, that my survival instincts were blurring out of my mind, that were telling me to flee. And it was also a feeling like, he's found me. Imagine the feeling when you play hide and seek, and your cousin is very slow finding anyone, so you sit somewhere for 20 minutes. At first, you feel the pleasure from the game, but then as time drags on, you get bored, and when they finally find you, it's almost like a relief. I think that something tried to stop me from walking away, because at some point there was a little desire to approach it. Anyway, it was obvious that it was following me, and the thing is I lived very close to that area. I didn't know what to do, either to wander through the streets so it would lose me, or go directly home. But this thing would know where I lived. I decided to run to safety immediately without looking back. And yes, that wasn't the end. That night, I had sleep paralysis. I remember laying in bed listening to the sound of water from my aquarium, when it suddenly stopped. I thought someone was trying to grab my attention, so I opened my eyes, and right next to the bed was the same black figure. This was it, the end of my life. I literally saw my entire existence flash before my eyes. It stood 3 feet away from me, and then it turned in a fog and started to fill my lungs through my nose and throat. When it was entirely inside my body, I awoke, or I didn't sleep at all, I don't know. The thing is, I haven't noticed any difference with myself since. This whole encounter was very different from anything I've seen in my life. There are things you've never experienced before, so you don't actually know what to think or feel, and are filled with curiosity. I am low-key disturbed. Would I one day find myself in the middle of nowhere approaching a random person with the skis on and disappearing next moment? Did that dream mean anything, or was it a dream? I barely remember that man's face. This has been a terribly odd and confusing experience, and if anyone has encountered anything similar, I'd love to hear about it, so that I know I'm not the only one. I was walking a trail alone one evening around a huge bluff that sticks up maybe 40 feet tall. The hike is a 1.5-mile hike. As I was on it, I got a call from my girlfriend at the time, so I answered and began to talk to her. It started to get dark, and I was dragging my feet along as we got chatting. All of a sudden, I started hearing rustling all around me. Growing up in a rural area of Illinois, I had a good sense of what was a pack of coyotes. I told my girl I was being followed and needed to have my wits about me. She was a little freaked but understood. I hung up and grabbed my pocket knife and found a stick I could whittle into a point as quickly as I could. As I'm walking down the trail, I could hear the rustling getting closer and closer, turning from stereo sound to 7.1 Dolby, to put it plainly. At this point I knew I was surrounded by them, but couldn't see them. I was on the cusp of a hill, and I wanted to get a good vantage point to defend myself, if it were to come to that. As I get to the top of the hill, I notice a doe just over the ridge, maybe 20 yards past it. The rustling had stopped. Everything was quiet. I realized that the coyotes weren't after me, but clearly hunting this deer, which was odd to begin with. I finally yelled, and the deer looked back, saw me, and took off like a bat out of hell. The second the deer moved, 4 coyotes came from behind me and ran full sprint past me, practically scraping my jeans as they passed, and I came careening down the side of the bluff. I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what the hell just happened. I haven't taken that trail since. It was pretty damn scary. I grew up in the woods, never had an encounter like that, and hope to never have one like that again. This happened a few years ago, and I figured I'd share it, as I find myself wondering what happened almost every day. My friend and I were interested in investigating a nearby abandoned factory that had a fire happen in it many years ago. So we geared up, grabbing everything we could to make sure we would be okay going into this place. There was a shattered glass window at the back of the factory, where we were going to enter the building from. The first time we pulled into the parking lot, she told me that she didn't like the feeling she was getting, so I pulled away from the building. We turned down a road, seeing a shadow with no features walking down the side of the building. His gait suggested he was injured. So, I turned around, and he was closer this time. We turned around to leave again, with our eyes on him the entire time, and he was gone. We chose to leave at that very moment and try and find a new location, and my friend started to become very silent and unresponsive to me talking to her. As we passed a few places, she started speaking in a monotone voice, staring straight ahead the whole time. She was telling me that someone hung themselves at this place. Someone burnt to death here. Someone shot someone here. Meanwhile, I tried to converse with her to no avail. We left the city we were in and pulled into a Walmart. As we were sitting there, she suddenly came to, asking where we were and what time it was and why we were there. She had no recollection of anything she had said or of any location we had visited. I then showed her a half-hour recording of her that I took on my old cell phone, and she was shocked and had to leave immediately. I went home and researched all the deaths she was talking about, and they were all accurate. I have been mountain biking since I was 11. It was the only thing that I thought would make me stand out from the crowd, and I was hooked. I moved to a smaller city when I was 15, which was surrounded by mountains and countless wild trails to explore. So I was thrilled when I finally found a riding buddy willing to take the risks. We went out riding all the time. He was born there, so he knew a lot of trails and was very familiar with the suburbs. We lived in a very religious community. Traditions oblige that in a certain month, we have to abstain from eating and drinking anything from sunrise to sunset. Our cycling hobby was no excuse to this tradition. During this month, we limited ourselves to a 30-kilometer ride every 2 days, in order not to cause ourselves physical harm or injury. As we were approaching the city limits returning from a ride, my friend urged me to check out this new trail he had discovered, and despite the exhaustion and dehydration, I obliged. We took a right turn into some woods. The trail was amazing, smooth dirt path, beautiful scenery, and occasional jumps. We were absolutely carried away, until the trail disappeared into fresh agricultural soil that was impossible to ride on. We hopped off the bikes to go back to our trail on foot, and as we walked back, I started to think this was a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't have gone too deep into the woods. We were in full mountain bike gear, flashy stuff, and easily noticeable from a distance. My friend was very calm though. We found our trail, and the second I lifted my leg to hop on my bike, some dude grabs my shoulder. 3 guys with dirty clothes, scarred faces, and reeked of BO and cow shit. "What are you doing here?" the older guy starts. I was too scared to speak, and my friend handles these kind of situations better, so he did the talking. They started asking us all kind of questions about our bikes and gear, till one of them laid a hand on my friend's bike and dragging it from him. I remember his exact words. "I'm sorry, but we're taking the bikes." Before we protested, he adds, "Are you fasting today or not?" I answered that we were. "Well, we're not. And if you weren't fasting, we would have taken the bikes and slashed you guys up before sunset." They said it in such a cool and strange tone, and topped it off with, "Stay safe out there." I was in awe. My friend told me he was about to pull out his knife when the guy grabbed his bike. I can only imagine what would have happened. I moved out of that city, picked up motorcycles, and we still ride together and joke about the encounter. I'm grateful it only turned out as badly as it did. I like to explore and fish a lot. They coincide a lot, so it's a pretty big passion of mine. I was hiking along a creek in a rural county near my home, in some dense game lands about 8 or so miles from any house, probably at least double that from a major road or settlement. I had hiked for a while and was hardly seeing any sign of human presence. Nearly every place I go in my state, I can find garbage, hunting trash, or any other sign that people have been there. If I see nothing, it is sort of a good sign that the area is undisturbed. As I was hiking, I heard gunshots far away. Not uncommon either, but the forest was oddly quiet, and yes, cliché incoming. I felt super uneasy, as if there was someone else there. Eventually, I found something really strange, and I've looked for the picture forever but can't find it. It was a small metal box, and I was well versed enough to know it was a geocache out in the open at the base of a tree. Let me remind you, this is several miles through thick woods and no sign of human habitation or influence. The box was rusty and looked to have been through a lot. I tried opening it, but a lot of sediment and rust had accumulated, and I got a little give, but nothing significant. There was definitely stuff rattling around, so I tried a ton and nothing would work. I realized it wasn't going to open, so I left it as I found it and put a piece of duct tape on the tree next to it to find it again. I left and went home, downloaded the geocaching app, but the box wasn't registered anywhere, nor were there really any geocaches along that creek at all, none registered for miles, so either it wasn't a geocache or maybe just really old. Anyway, the very next day I went back armed with a crowbar, hammer and pliers. I went back to the exact spot it was in, as I had put the duct tape right around the ground besides the tree, but the box was nowhere to be found. I looked all around and couldn't find it, at which point several miles from civilization and several more from cell service, I booked it out there. I realized that this isn't spooky or supernatural, but it put me on the edge more than anything else I've ever been through. Years ago, when I was 13 years old, I went on a trip to celebrate Easter with my mum's family. It was a tradition for us to go have a picnic in the middle of a big field, 40 minutes from my grandma's house. The field is basically in the middle of nowhere in rural Mexico. That day, my cousins and I got very curious about a small hill we could see from the field. It always caught our attention because it looks like a giant took a big bite out of it. I know it used to work as a rock mine several years prior. And anyway, we decided to go investigate and left the picnic. We walked for 20 minutes until we crossed a road and went up a hill. Once there, we started looking for a way to trespass a metallic fence that kept us from going into the actual mine, and eventually we found a hole in it. My cousin was recording with her cell phone as we were making jokes and acting like normal cringy teenagers, when suddenly she froze and whispered, "Hey, there's something in the rocks," and she pointed her camera to the rock wall behind us. At first I thought she was joking, but something about her expression seemed off, so I turned back, and there was a human dog-like hybrid looking at us from a hole in the rocks, about 20 to 30 meters above the ground. It had pink, pale, and wrinkly skin and a long snout and long ears, white eyes, and hands with long fingernails. It had no hair, and it kept still, just watching us. After what felt like an eternity, the weird creature finally went into the hole again, and we started running back to the picnic spot. We showed the video to our family right after being scolded for going so far without saying anything to anyone, but you could barely see anything on the video. After all these years, I still don't know what that thing was, and I get goosebumps when I think about it. The mother of my best friend had a brother working on that mine in the 70s or so, and she claims that he and other workers died there, but the families never got the bodies back. Apparently rocks collapsed multiple times, killing the people working and making it very difficult to retrieve the corpses. Well, that's what the owners of the mine said to all the families involved. After a few incidents, they decided to close the mine for good. Back when I was in high school, my friends and I loved exploring creepy places. A few of us had our driver's license, so on weekend nights we would gather a group of 6 to 10 people and go on an adventure. One summer, our favorite place to go was this abandoned movie theater on the west end of town. This place had probably closed down about 3 years before we started visiting it, and in that time it had become a run-down building. There were no trespassing signs on the front entrance, and each of the fire exits around the building coming from the theater rooms. The glass at the main entrance was all broken and had been boarded up. The front door was busted and didn't latch or lock, so people were able to get inside. We knew there had to be homeless people crashing in there, but we were young and dumb and felt invincible as a group. It was part of what made it scary. We would always wait until between 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. to get into places like this, because we didn't want anyone to see or hear us or report us to the cops. We all explored it together the first 2 times we went in. The screens and seats were all torn up inside each of the maybe 8 rooms. The bathroom mirrors were broken, and there was graffiti everywhere. We were fairly sure there were people hiding in there while we were inside, even if we never saw anyone the first 2 times we went in. There were a couple of shopping carts from a nearby Fred Meyer's inside, with cans and bottles in them and a few dirty blankets scattered around in different rooms. It looked lived in. After getting to know the layout of the place the first couple of trips, we made a game of it for the 3rd and final visit. This time the 6 of us that went split into 3 groups of 2, and with our partner, the 2 of us that would enter the front together and spend a full 5 minutes inside while the other waited outside at our chosen exit in the back building. The first 2, Beck and Doug, both went in while we waited outside. About 7 minutes went by, and just as we were starting to worry that we should go in after them, they made it out the other side through the fire exit. Doug told us that they went upstairs into the office, and there was a sleeping bag there that hadn't been there on the previous visit, and as soon as they went up there and saw it, they tried to leave immediately. But they turned around and tried to leave through the wrong exit. They were paranoid that they were being followed out, so they just stood there watching their way, entered the theater room for a minute, make sure they didn't hear any noise, before finally worked up the nerve to run out the right exit in the room across the hallway. Both Doug and Beck wanted us to leave, but Jack and I weren't having any of that and insisted on going in. Brad and Drew, the other 2 of the group that were going to go in last, wanted to come with us. So the 4 of us went inside while Beck and Doug both waited at the exit. The first thing we all wanted to do when we got inside was go check out the upstairs office. Just as we started to make our way up the stairs, we all heard a loud banging sound. It was coming from the back of the theater. We all agreed it had to be Beck and Doug trying to scare us, so that we could come out and we could leave. We got upstairs and the pounding stopped. Doug was right. There was a sleeping bag rolled out on the ground with a few paper bags set up around it. Brad flashed a light in one of them and saw a syringe and something that looked like a vibrator We were all pretty grossed out and had a little laugh about it. We looked around up there and didn't really notice anything else interesting, and we were staring back down the stairs when the pounding started again. We decided we should probably make our way to the exit. I hoped we hadn't been caught trespassing by the cops. We came out through the exit and immediately both Doug and Beck were talking over themselves to tell us that about a minute after we entered, a really tall, homeless-looking, creepy man with greasy hair walked right past them, heading for the entrance. Beck said hello as he passed, and the guy stopped, turned and kind of lunged a few inches towards him before stopping. One side of his face was really wrinkly. Beck thinks that he might have been a burn victim or something. The guy stared him down for a few seconds, and then without saying anything, turned and walked around the corner where we had gone inside. They started pounding on the door right after he was out of sight, to try and warn us there was a scary dude in there with us. We were in there for about 5 minutes with this guy, and never saw him. He had to have heard us and hid somewhere. We started to walk back to our car in the Fred Meyer's parking lot, about 100 yards away, and a car pulled into the parking lot and shined its headlights on us, before flashing its red and blues. The police officers had us all sit down in front of the spotlight in front of the car and asked us what we were doing. We told him we were going to head inside the movie theater, but a really scary tall guy walked in and we chickened out. He told us it was really dangerous to go into places like that, as there had been violence in that building before, and it'd be a shame if we were going to be hurt doing something stupid. He let us go when we drove off, and we saw him shining a light inside the front entrance. We took the nice police officer's advice and never went into places like that again. I never did find out what violence he was talking about. It could have just been a tactic to scare us out of coming back. But regardless, we stuck to graveyards and cemeteries after this. Better to be safe than sorry after all. I've had a lot of strange jobs, but one of the most interesting was working for a tax company based out of Texas. I lived in Kentucky, my home state at the time, but because this company contracted out jobs remotely, I was able to make a very good living for performing tasks which were generally very simple. I had a work partner, and our duty was to travel all over the eastern and central part of the state to county courthouse PVA offices. You might not have those, it's a small town thing, and research delinquent property taxes. We were then required to compile a list of properties who had delinquent taxes and submit it to our boss. She was our primary contact in Texas. This part is important because it was the only reason we would sometimes have to deal with hostile people. The company would then buy the taxes if the property tickled their fancy, and a letter was issued to the owner of the property, stating they had a certain amount of time to repay the amount. I'm not sure what would happen after that, since that isn't part of my job. But I do know that people immediately assumed, because of lack of knowledge or understanding of the law, this company was going to take their property and throw them out on the street. Before the company bought the taxes, however, they would send us back a list of the ones they were interested in, and we would then go out to the location, photograph the property, and then submit all the photos to our Texas contact. This is where things got interesting. It was like the property owners had some kind of psychic intuition about us. They had no idea who we were or when we were coming, since we worked almost always on our own, and they didn't know what kind of color car we would be in. Yet somehow they would frequently burst out their front doors as we pulled up to take pictures of their location. This made for some interesting and often frightening confrontations. After getting comfortable with the job, I even came up with a convincing story to tell angry property owners when they chased us down with their car. We're from the Country Property Valuation Administration. We're just updating our property files and need a current photo. This would de-escalate the situation, and they'd apologize for threatening our lives and sometimes running us off the road to make us pull over. I had a lot of stories from this job, but here's the best one. We were deep in the hills of eastern Kentucky one day, searching desperately for a single wide trailer from our list. We found a holler matching our direction. This is way before the GPS days, and we had to use real country maps and took a chance. As we drove up the holler, houses began to spread out further and further, and soon we were totally isolated. Nothing but trees and a narrow gravel road. Suddenly we spotted the trailer. It didn't look anything like it did in the PVA picture. Time had really taken a toll on this place. Some of you might not understand this depending on where you're from, but around my home state, one grows very accustomed to the look and feel of a potential location for drug manufacturing. I know that might not make sense, but trust me, we knew immediately that this place was a prime location for a meth lab. We didn't spot the trailer until we had driven a little ways past it, so we didn't get a great photo on the way in. As usual, we decided to drive on by, turn around, and get the shot on the way back. Apparently someone saw us on the way in. This was a very rural road, and not even a road at this point, since it had turned to gravel a mile or two back. I basically had to turn the car by pulling up onto an embankment and doing what felt like a 32-point turn to keep from going off into a ditch. While I was turning, my buddy said, "Hey, look." I looked, and 3 people were walking out of the woods into the road. Just people, no big deal. I had the car straightened out on the road at this point, and noticed they had weapons. A young, nasty-looking fellow was holding a baseball bat of all things. A nasty-looking older fellow had a shovel. Both were shirtless. And then there was a screaming girl. Something clicked in my head. On the drive-in, when my partner snapped the photo, I heard a girl scream. It was an angry scream, but I couldn't make out what she said. I didn't even know where it came from, and I certainly didn't think the scream was directed at us. Apparently it was. These people were now walking with intention towards my car. I kept thinking, is this really happening? And what exactly is happening? My partner was freaking out a little, unconvinced they were going to attack us. It's hard to explain what was going on through my head at this point, because I couldn't really believe what I was seeing. The only thing I could think of was, hit 'em with the car, just like on Grand Theft Auto, otherwise you're gonna die. They were screaming, shaking their weapons and closing in, and I was running out of time. I revved the tiny engine in my red Pontiac Grand Prix, hoping to scare them, and then I let off the gas. I plowed towards them with the fury of all 6 cylinders, or 4, however many there were, and they jumped out of the way at the last minute, as I grazed by them, throwing gravel and dirt into the air. Once we were at a safe distance, I slowed down and looked back. Luckily they were gone. Unluckily, we were once again too far from the trailer to get a good shot. I explained this to my boss when I emailed her my day's recollection of property photos, and she seemed to understand. After that, I kept a loaded .45 in my glove box and felt significantly more confident while doing my job. I quit a couple of years later though. It was just too dangerous, even if I was packing heat. So to the hillbilly meth-making counterparts of Otis, Baby, and Captain Spaulding, let's not meet again. In college, I lived up on top of a mountain road, but still only 5 minutes to tow down a trail through the woods. There was a 100-plus-year-old oak in the yard, slab stone porch built by hand. I lived in the studio apartment that was outside the main house. The main house was haunted, but my shack was cozy. The woods up there were weird too. I've never really been in the main house, after all, but the three who lived there said some nights you couldn't sleep from all the noise, the floorboards creaking, the thumps and knocks. My experiences happened outside. Like I said, I hunted small game up there, as there must have been a rabbit colony in the vicinity, plus a few squirrel drays. Often out there while I was stalking, I'd get the distinct feeling of being stalked myself. Keep in mind, this stand of forest is only several acres, but it was preserved mainly because of the historic oak trees scattered about. It's old woods. I would hear laughter, like children's laughter, but not quite like in a creepy movie. It was a bit distorted, and almost like flirty giggles that you might imagine a fairy make. It would come from a different location each time I sought it, and I eventually decided to stop following it and hunt. It never did stop. I would sometimes spend an afternoon in town having drinks or hanging at my friend's place. I'd finally leave and have enough liquid courage to hike back up the trail in the dark. That laughter would be replaced by noise, just like things running all around you and dashing about the trees. I've been an outdoorsman for a long time, and I know the woods are noisy at night, particularly in the southern Appalachians. But this was different. It was dead silent out there in that stand at night, except for this rushing to and from by some unseen feet. Not like game fleeing, deer run away and crash about doing it. These steps were like something or things running swiftly around me. It's like it would cross the trail ahead, and then behind me, and then alongside me, but I would never see it. I was a big-time night owl back then, and was regularly up doing schoolwork into 3 or 4 a.m. One such night, it had just snowed a fresh 20 inches or so, decent accumulation for the area. Our yard and the woods were like a paradise for me and my dog. I was excited to hunt around the next day for tracks, and see if I could locate the rabbit den precisely. I was up working and the dog came scratching to get me, not frantic or anything. I let her in and she lay down to sleep. Odd because she's a husky and preferred the snow to my tiny heated apartment every time. I decided to call a night too and went out for a cigarette. It was 3:24 a.m. I can still see it on the top of my MacBook display before I closed it. I went out, noted the clouds were dispersed a bit more, and the moon was bright on the snow. I lit my cigarette, and was just looking out across the fence and into the woods, when something caught my eye. It looked like a silhouette of someone leaning against one of those big oak trees, like you'd see someone with a palm planted against the wall, with one arm straight out leaning against it. It's not moving, so I can't tell if I'm just tired, or if the lighting is funny or what. So I walked further to the end of the porch, and as soon as I stepped onto the fresh snow, there it took off. The thing was tall. My estimates based on the tree put the thing at 7 feet tall. It ran along the border of the fence and back off into the woods. It was hairless as far as I could tell, and completely naked. Otherwise, though, its form was just that of a skinny, tall man. I went inside and switched to boots, grabbed my rifle and my flashlight, and I went to check the tracks. I picked up a set of what had to be at least a size 14 or 15 bare foot. It ran along the fence and down the treeless stretch of backyard, as if heading into the woods. But then the tracks ended about 20 inches short of the wood line. I don't know if they managed to jump to the tree line. Probably because there weren't any more tracks that I could find that night or the next day. It's like it just completely vanished after that. Today, me and my two friends went up on the mountain behind my house, up to an abandoned mine. We went up to play airsoft, so we had a bunch of airsoft rifles. It was foggy and drizzling, but we didn't think about it. Anyway, at 4:50 we were starting to leave. By this time, it was almost dark out, and there was a very heavy fog setting all around us. We were just messing about by the old abandoned bucket crane when my friend Connor says that he sees a figure looming towards us in the fog. We thought it might have been a cop or some crackhead, so naturally we started hustling to leave. But the figure seemed off. It looked big and burly and seemed to move towards us at a relatively quick pace. I should mention that the fire siren from the neighboring town started going off, and the forest goes dead quiet. So Connor yelled out to it, to receive no response. I swear I saw a dog-like creature, but my friend says he saw a person. We took off down the old gravel road, just down the bend, so we were out of sight of the thing, and ducked into the woods, down about a 10 or 12-foot tall hill. We got 500 feet away from the road when we stopped to see if we were being followed. I saw behind some trees at about my 11 o'clock a figure that seemingly ducked behind the tree. My friend said things were moving to my 1 o'clock. They said they heard screaming almost like a wailing. I, however, heard a dog's bark. We slowly started back and eventually got to an ATV trail, where we found a path down to the street. We sprinted down the path, and eventually hit the road where my friend said it was following us to the road, where once we were a block away. Through the fog and in the middle of the road, I saw the dog sitting, looking at us, but my friends claimed to have again seen a person. My question is, what the hell was that? A skinwalker, perhaps? We live in eastern Pennsylvania, so I think that's unlikely. Any suggestions as to what it could be would be appreciated. There is a man-made reservoir located approximately 3 miles from my home, which spans generously over 650 acres of preserved state land. Along with boating, kayaking, and fishing, a lot of people use the reservoir to walk, as the massive lake is surrounded by at least 5 combined miles of hiking trails. Since moving to the area in 2004, I have spent a lot of time at that reservoir, which I never believed to be haunted, until I had an experience there I will never forget. It was late fall, so most of the leaves had already fallen off the trees, making it easier to see squirrels scampering away from the sound of my footsteps, or birds flittering from branch to branch hundreds of feet from the trail. At this point, I had been walking for about 45 minutes, so I was pretty far back into the woods and hadn't seen another person the entire time. On this particular trail, there is a landmark of sorts, a bench, that I use to determine how far I've walked, and I usually turn back when I reach it. Just before the bench there is a narrow fishing trail that leads to the reservoir's banks. As I crossed the fishing trail, I noticed the sudden appearance of an older man with shoulder-length white hair, wearing a straw fishing hat, suspenders, and blue jeans. He was carrying a rusty metal bucket in one hand and a dog's leash in the other. I searched the spot that his gaze was fixated upon, the ground at the end of the leash. There was no dog to be found anywhere near the man, and the clip at the end of the leash was lying motionless in the dirt. Surprised yet not quite startled, I said to the man, "Hello." His eyes turned towards me, but he said nothing. This was concerning to me because he seemed old enough to be my grandfather, and he was all alone in the woods. "Are you all right?" I asked the man, stepping towards him. Again he said nothing, and did not move but continued to look me in the eye. I decided not to pester the man anymore. Surely, if he was in some kind of trouble, he would tell someone. I stumbled along in semi-confusion towards the bench, the man now gone from my peripherals. When I reached the bench, I took a few minutes to stretch and take a swig of water, hoping that in that time the man would have crossed the trail and disappeared into the forest. Much to my surprise, as I approached the fishing trail once again, I still saw the man and his eyes were once again cast down to the end of the leash. I kept my eyes from making contact with him this time, directing my focus on the fallen leaves and snarling branches in front of me. As I crossed the fishing trail once again, I could feel the man's eyes turn towards me, but I did not return his gaze. Instead, I waited until I had crossed the path and could look at him from a distance through the mostly barren trees. Underneath the brim of the man's straw hat was a grey complexion, contrasted by glowing yellow eyes looking straight into my soul. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, and it suddenly felt as if all my breath had been stolen away by the wind. I stared back for a moment, and then instinct took over, turning my crunching steps into panicked strides. Every few seconds I glanced back at the yellow eyes, hoping I'd imagined them, to no avail. They remained present, until I had gotten far enough away, and the density of the trees obscured them completely. What the hell was that? All I could think of was that question while I slammed my feet along the trail. I racked my brains for any and all logical explanations for what I had just seen, and came up with one that made some kind of sense. This man, definitely not a ghost but a man, had probably been fishing at the bottom of the trail and got tired on the way up, explaining his need to take a break. He probably isn't much of a people person and didn't want to have a meaningless conversation with me. I get it. As for his eyes glowing yellow, maybe the sun was catching them in a certain way. The more I reasoned, the more confused I became, and could no longer remember how long I had been running. As I rounded a corner, I almost ran into another hiker, and nearly jumped out of my skin at the sight of her. "Hi," the hiker said cheerily as she passed. I returned her greeting, then turned toward her and said, "Wait, this is gonna sound insane, but I don't think you should walk down there." She froze, now noticing my bewildered expression, and said, "What happened?" I breathed deeply and spoke my truth about what I saw to this stranger, fearing that I would sound absolutely bonkers. Surprisingly enough, she believed my story, but found no reason to believe that the man I had seen was something paranormal. Instead, we walked together to the end of the trail and used an emergency phone to contact the reservoir's ranger on staff, to whom we told about a man in the woods possibly needing medical assistance. We followed the ranger to the spot that I had seen the man, and told him that I would rather not go with him. The other hiker and I waited for the ranger to return, and when he did, he looked disappointed and irritated. "There was no one there, miss," the ranger said with exhaustion. "Well, I'm sorry to bother you. It just seemed like he needed help. He really didn't look well," I retorted. The ranger left, and the hiker and I made small talk for a few minutes before I said, "Do you think it's possible what I saw wasn't human?" Confusion swept over her face for a moment, before she realized what I meant and then said, "You definitely looked like you saw a ghost when you passed me on the trail." It's been years since these events transpired, Yet I still find myself peering down the same fishing trail each time I pass it, expecting those yellow eyes and that twisted grey expression. I have never had another paranormal experience at this location, though I have sensed the presence of others many times while hiking here. When I was around 10 years old and feeling adventurous, I would go riding my bike down my parents' road, which was dead-ended 2 miles down at the only neighbor's house, or exploring around in the endless acres of pasture surrounding our house. We were way out in the boonies. The back of one pasture sloped down to a slough/creek, which fed into a small pond in our neighbor's pasture. The area had some woods around it, and I decided it was a good place to return to play. The neighbors were an older couple who had lived in the area for years and never really went anywhere, and I didn't think they would mind if I played there. One day I was playing around the pond and found a lot of mussels, like oysters, buried in the mud. I dug a couple and took them home. A few days later in the same spot, it looked like a lot more had been dug up, and they had been opened and eaten, which would be okay for a raccoon or something, but there were some big boot prints that couldn't possibly have been mine. I should have had a lot more sense, but I kept going back after finding things. Once there was a plastic bag full of trash, some ripped up clothes and a tarp. They were still down there next time I came back, and I heard a car coming down the road. I laid my bike down and hid in the slough. It was dried up at this point, about 4 feet deep, on the other side of the pond. And a man pulled up coming from the neighbor's end of the road in a black boxy looking car, maybe a Cadillac, and got out wearing a suit. He grabbed the trash bag and clothes and threw the bones in a hole, looked around, got back in the car, and headed out of there quickly. I went back after he left and looked at the bones and took one of them home. I pedaled as fast as my short, stubby legs would go. My dad said it looked like a deer or cow bone and threw it out. It wasn't until I started studying pre-med in college that I realized it was a human radius, likely that of a woman or older child. This was 5 years ago. My good friends and I were about 15 years of age, and doing what kids do, we snuck out every weekend and had older friends in high school to drive us places. In this particular situation, we decided to check out this 8th-floor abandoned hospital 10 minutes away from our city. It being 8 a.m., and one of the worst winters in Michigan we had seen in the past 12 years. It was at least -15, with wind chill, because the hospital was less than 200 feet from the Detroit River. So my friends and I arrive, trying not to draw attention because we didn't want police attention. We jumped a 6-foot brick wall only to fall into the courtyard, which had easily 5 feet of unshoveled snow. So we trudged through it to the only entrance of the hospital, which is a back door with a staircase that goes up and down to the basement. Every other door was chained or barricaded, so we made entry and immediately saw satanic worshipping symbols on the walls in red spray paint. Some type of sacrificed animal, which was far too mutilated to even tell what it was, but judging by the size, I'd guess it could have been a small dog. So at this point, my 4 friends and I are disgusted, horrified, and a little bit pissed off. 2 of my friends go down to the basement, while me and the other 2 go upstairs. Flashlights in tote, we all kept seeing silhouettes moving across the hallway in front of us, but always from a distance, so we brushed it off for the moment. But then, we had a medical desk tip over in the room down the hall from us, which sent items flying out the room into the hall. We ran so fast, not knowing if it was a bum or a demon, Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, my other two friends in the basement of the hospital had found the room where they stored all the hospital beds and swore that something was thrown right at them, and they were certain they found the morgue, and they just had to check it out, because there was something that they had to see. So as we moved down the stairs, I kept hearing faint singing, but as if it were a little girl, so I kept thinking my friend behind me was being a smartass. "Stop it, John." "Thought it was you," he replies. So we stop in unison, and all of us hear what sounds like a little girl humming a song, but it wasn't further than a few flights of stairs above us. We all said screw it, ran out the building, hopped the wall and left. Since then we have tried to return, but they have picked up police patrols in the area, so it would have been far too risky. This happened 2 years ago in Oregon. It was my birthday in April. We took a trip deep woods hiking and camping, as that was my favorite thing to do. I also remember this incident well, as this was a time when my wisdom tooth was flaring up, and I was in pain. Not excruciating, but certainly annoying. We had spent the day driving around the woods and hiking when nightfall had started to set in. It had rained all day, sometimes hard and other times barely a mist. But as the sun started to set, you could tell there was a nasty spring storm rolling in. We drove up a remote forest road that hadn't been maintained in what seemed like years. The trees had grown into the road and scraped against the vehicle, but we liked camping off the beaten path to avoid humans. We had come to an area where the road widened on the top of the butte and was surrounded by second-growth forest and some scattered old-growth trees. We stopped the car and prepared the car for sleeping. I don't sleep in a tent anymore. I flat out refuse. We had sat in the car listening to the wind pick up, and it was going to be a nasty storm. The trees were rocking, and it was a bit unnerving. Being on a high point on the terrain made the wind a bit worse. We had the windows down, as there was more wind, and the rain was only a drizzle. That night wasn't particularly cold, so it was comfortable to have the windows down. That's when I started to hear the noises. Every so often I'd hear what sounded like two men talking off in the woods. You can hear it more clearly from my side of the car, when the wind calmed down in between gusts. You could kind of hear it when the wind picked up, though, more drowned out. I could tell whatever it was making these sounds was off at a distance. You couldn't make out anything they were saying. It sounded like they were having a very continuous conversation, though, as there were never any breaks in the noise. My roommate was talking, and I asked him to stop for a moment and listen. He then heard the voices and didn't know what to make of it. Then things got ugly. At least my fear level shot to that point. We started to hear what sounded like a baby crying off in the distance on my roommate's side of the car. That for some reason made me absolutely nauseous. It's the middle of nowhere, pitch black outside, and all these noises are not your typical crickets and are louder than the winds of the storm. As these noises seemed to get closer, we decided we'd had enough and drove in the direction of leaving this forest road. When we got to about 2 miles down the road, it intersected with a more maintained forest road, and we stopped there to organize all the stuff, as we had gotten comfortable, leaving blankets on us and food out. As we sat there organizing the stuff, we heard the sound of people talking at a distance. Then they stopped altogether. We sat there in silence for 15 minutes, and you could hear something running down the road from behind the car. It ran right up to the car faster than anything I'd ever seen. It's like it floated, and this huge black mass comes right up to the driver's side window. That's when my roommate floored it, and we took off. I couldn't see any details of this creature, as it was pitch black outside, but it was extremely large and dark. The mass was like an upright cow running up to your car. We ended up getting to the main highway and drove another half-hour down the ridge and camped elsewhere. By then we were exhausted. Nothing happened at the new location, but I was on edge. It was a birthday I'll never forget. I still deep wilderness hike, but with protection, and even then I still feel intimidated at times. As you're walking, you seem to feel fine, but when you stop for a break, you catch that feeling sometimes, like something is staring daggers through you from the tree line. Wyoming is one of the largest states in America, covering nearly 98,000 square miles. Despite its size, Wyoming has less than 600,000 residents, making it one of the least populated states in the US. Its history is rich and is as dark as the coal that fills the endless stream of boxcars winding their way across the western plains. Many battles and a great deal of blood has been shed by both the white man and the Native Americans in the fight over the lands and its resources. So, as you can well imagine, many residents believe the land is cursed. There are countless stories of paranormal activity, from ghost encounters, Bigfoot sightings, to skinwalkers and cryptids alike. Not to mention stories of UFOs and alien abductions. This story, however, is not about spirits or anything of that nature. As a kid, my family would often go camping at Lake DeSmet, just outside of Buffalo. These camping trips often included taking the boat out for some water skiing and/or fishing. On one particular trip, my father and I were fishing in the middle of the lake. The water was so calm and still, it almost resembled glass. The glare from the midsummer sun's reflection off the water was nearly blinding. Still, we talked lazily about everything and nothing. I recall my father commenting on the fact he thought it was rather strange the fish were not biting at all. He stated it as if something had scared them away. I didn't give what he said much thought, as I was preoccupied by the sudden ripples that began to dance across the water, giving the lake's surface a funhouse mirror effect. I recall thinking it was rather odd for this to be occurring, considering there was no boat or anyone in sight for that matter. My heart began to pound in my chest, as the ripples soon turned to waves that slapped against the side of the boat, with enough force to cause it to rock back and forth. Judging from the look on my father's face, I could tell he too was feeling uneasy about the current situation. "Dad, are you seeing this?" I asked, trying to keep the fear from creeping into my voice. "I am," is all he could say, his eyes nervously scanning the lake. I should point out that the lake is said to have a depth of 70 feet on average and 130 feet at its deepest. Others say no one knows how deep it truly is. There are countless stories regarding a creature known as Smetty. Descriptions of the cryptid are as varied as the sightings. Some describe it as a giant eel with a horse-like head, while others say it resembles an enormous alligator. Most witnesses describe the monster as a classic Loch Ness Monster-style creature. Now keep in mind, I had heard all of the stories and truly believed they were just tall tales. However, all the doubt I had was blown out of the water as I watched what looked like the head and neck of a massive sea monster rise out of the depths, about 50 yards from the boat. As we watched in silence, the creature lazily drifted across the water as if it didn't have a care in the world. Needless to say, my father and I were peeing ourselves with excitement and fear. It was my father that first broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned. It does exist. Yeah. Neither of us had thought to bring a camera, so there was no way to capture a picture of the encounter. To be honest, even if we would have, we were both so shaken I doubt either of us would have gotten a decent picture at all. We just sat there staring in awe and disbelief for what seemed like hours. In truth, the whole encounter lasted maybe all of 2 minutes, before the lake creature disappeared beneath the lake's surface. My father and I looked at one another without speaking and quickly began reeling in our lines. Well, I guess I know why the fish weren't biting, I pointed out. Indeed, my father replied, with a slight shiver. I think it's time for us to get the hell out of this lake, he suggested. I nodded my head in agreement, and without another word to my father, cranked the boat's motor, and we hauled ass back to shore, cautiously keeping an eye out for the monster. I've been back to Lake de Smet many times since, and have yet to see the creature again. However, sightings and stories continue to circulate. Although there is no actual proof that Smetty exists, I know without a doubt that it indeed does. If any of you have seen it or heard about this elusive creature, I would love to hear from you down below. I was in Big Bend National Park about 20 years ago, prepping for a backpacking series presentation for REI. Big Bend is the western portion of Texas that dips towards along the bend of the Rio Grande that forms the border with Mexico. It's mixed high desert and smaller mountains. Gorgeous place, great history. I was hiking the area near Santa Elena Canyon, probably a couple of hours before sunset, to try and get pics for the presentation. This area of the park opens into a comparatively flat section of the basin, where the river broadens and the wildlife tends to be more diverse and obvious. I was several hundred meters away from my van, which was parked in a designated lot at what passed for a trailhead at the time. As I approached the river basin near the mouth of my canyon, I saw something really unusual. So unusual, in fact, it took a few seconds for my brain to sort the puzzle. Something was moving on the other side of the river, and it was big, man-sized, but low to the ground. The color of a deer, perhaps, and shuffling along. It looked, for first impression, to be a medium-sized white-tailed doe, lying on its side and moving like a snake. But that's not a thing that happens, so I moved in a bit to improve my line of sight. It was a mountain lion, a big cat, a very big cat. It was creeping along, low-slung, hunting something that was probably no more than a stone's toss from where I was standing. I'd never seen one before, and when the visual information finally passed, I think my blood froze. Then it looked at me. I'll probably never forget that bit. You could see that little calorie calculator turn on in its eyes. I've never been so thankful for a river in my life. Granted, at this time, and maybe still, the river was very low due to the drought and unauthorized and unlawful irrigation practices upstream, and you could likely cross at several points at this location with minimal risk, but it was still quite broad and definitely looked like part of a potent water barrier. Death Kitty does a series of double takes, head shifting from me to whatever the prey location was back and forth rapidly. Said calorie calculator and risk calculator trying to get a fix on this evening's menu. I die a little inside, maintain my facing, and begin slowly and quietly moving away. Not sure if I was worth it, if the river was too much of an X factor, or if the biggin just really wasn't that into me. But no chase was given, and after breaking line of sight, I was able to get back into the van just fine with no signs of pursuit, and some mild trachycardia. That was the longest short walk I've ever taken. Later that night I was parked off the Maine Park Road in an area where big cats commonly hunted. I'll always remember being parked there in the middle of nowhere, munching on slightly stale Oreos and a bottle of water, listening to the occasional growl or scream of a big cat peel out of the darkness, and being thankful for my relatively fortunate position on the food chain. Also, one night while I was on NyQuil, I hallucinated after getting a respiratory illness and woke up screaming. At a mountain, at 3 a.m, at the public campsite, but that's someone else's scary story. I was visiting my cousin's house. I have 4 cousins, 2 twin girls aged 10, and then the older brother aged 21, and other older brother aged 26. I was sleeping in the room with the cousin of my age, 21. We heard things falling in the girls' room right next to where we were. We assumed it was just them playing, but one of them started talking to the other, and they were across the room. So my cousin stepped out of the room to go check, and I watched over his shoulders through the doorway. Right as the girls were explaining that stuff was falling without provocation, a sort of humanoid type thing came bursting out the closet. It looked humanesque, but was much longer and thinner and ran on all 4 legs. It ran out the house, broke the front door hinge, and straight through the screen door. We called the police immediately, and they were there within 5 minutes. They looked in a 5-mile radius and nothing was found. They gathered DNA from the door, as apparently the thing was cut by shattering wood on the door, as there was still a small amount of blood on it. They ran tests, and it was determined to be inconclusive. They said it was similar to human DNA, but not in the way ape DNA is similar. It wasn't a human though, they knew that much. So to this day we have had no incidents with whatever this thing is. They still live in the house, have no problems, but we have zero explanation for what happened, and what the thing was, and how it got into the house. I grew up in upstate New York, not like Rochester, New York, but backwoods of the Finger Lakes, New York. I lived in a smaller city, but my best friend and his somewhat well-off family lived in a very secluded area a good many miles outside of town. His family owned a huge plot of land, and his neighbors had also given his family permission to roam their land, adding up to hundreds of acres. We had been close since elementary school, and had an interesting dynamic. He loved coming to my house to be in town around people, and I loved going to his place to escape the woods and enjoy nature. Around the time we turned 14, we started to explore deeper into the forest than before. Somewhat due to our interest in exploration, but mostly due to his family not wanting us to go too deep into the woods for fear of getting lost or running across the bears that lived nearby. After a few hikes, maybe a mile or so up the hill, we discovered a vast network of old logging trails and abandoned campsites full of junk. Most of the junk that was distinguishable was made of glass, bottles of all sizes and colors, and an assortment of old power insulators from power lines long since decayed. We guessed from 1930s, but what does a 14-year-old know about dating such things? One day, about a year later, we decided to explore deeper. An important fact of the situation is his father had spent a great deal of time teaching us firearm safety. This was for many reasons, but a running rule was not to venture into the woods without a firearm to scare off the bears or deal with situations that could arise. This has never been an issue. and certainly felt like a good rule. We packed snacks, water, some super basic camping supplies, and 2 rifles. We set off to venture as far into the trails as we could, with enough time to return before dark. We started up the trails we were used to and found an old path that seemed to be a bit more dense in vegetation and had a small stream running alongside it. We followed it and found 4 more campsites with all the same junk piles as the others, except one which has a wooden shed that was mostly collapsed with some cans and rusted tools inside. Nothing very special, but an exciting discovery for a 15-year-old kid. We proceeded another mile or so, and we noticed a dark silhouette about 1/4 mile down the trail. Clearly a large structure, but definitely not a house or shed. As we got closer there, we clearly saw the rectangular wooden structure. It was in good condition despite clearly being very old. A single door on the end of the short side was closed, as were the 6 windows along the long side, leading towards the stream that ran to the right of the trail. There was rotting wood along the stream edge, which we figured was once a water wheel to power whatever this building once did. As we approached the door, we readied the flashlight we had, but something strange happened. It might have been our nerves in the moment, of course, but the normal sounds of the wood dimmed. No leaves shaking, no animals scurrying, nothing. Even the stream seemed silent. The sort of silence which makes your skin crawl. The sort of silence where you can seem to hear your own blood flow. We opened the door and turned on the flashlight. It was very dark inside, as the wooden shutters kept the light out quite well, with small slivers of light peeking between the various boards making up the structure. The room was small and mostly empty. On the left, a small workbench stood with a rusty saw blade and some rusted chains on it. Otherwise, only some nails sticking out of the wall broke up the room. We walked towards the door across the room and opened it, with the trail of light from the front door following us, as we had no intention on closing it. We stepped into the next room, and immediately suffered a series of shivers and goosebumps, but neither of us wanted to seem scared to the other, so we continued looking around. We scanned the room, which was a bit more exciting than the last 2. Larger windows on each side, and yet another door opposite us, with many more rusted items around. As we looked over the various rusted items, we slowly walked deeper into the room, and we approached the center of the room as it grew darker. Suddenly, the front door shut. We both jumped and looked back, shining the flashlight, but nothing was there, except the door with its faint bands of light shining through its old boards. We caught our breath and decided it must have been the wind, and pressed on. We approached the door, and it was certainly noticeable we both wanted to get out of here, due to the unease of the air inside. We entered the last room, and it was the same as the first, except there was a larger table instead of a bench along the wall. Nothing sat on it, but a hammer lied on the floor at its base. The hammer seemed newer than the previous items, but we would not have time to inspect it, as we jumped in terror when the first door to the prior room slammed shut. This was clearly not the wind, and both of us immediately panicked. We drew our rifles and yelled as we slowly backed towards the door in the room we had not opened yet. We noticed the light through its boards as we entered the room, so we assumed it was the exit, and now it was the only option we felt we had. We yelled again this time, forming words instead of the frightened yell we had before. "Is someone there?" But nothing. We opened the door behind us, watching into the dark room we had been in previously, and stepped out into the silent woods. We looked around and saw no one, which was almost more unsettling than it would have been had there actually been someone. We started walking down the trail towards his home using the stream as a navigation marker. As we started to lose sight of the structure, we thought we saw something outside the door that we had exited. We were startled, but we were almost certain it wasn't there before. A shadow that resembled the outline of an average height person. We pressed on another half-mile or so and started to hear twigs and sticks breaking a good ways behind us. We turned around and looked, but saw no movement. Instead, a shadow almost silhouetting a person stood by a tree about 500 yards from us. "Hello? Why are you following us? We're armed." But again, no response. No movement, not a noise, it just existed there next to the tree. We started to run down the trail, and about a mile further along we turned back, and it was there again, over some bushes, about the same distance back it stood. We really felt the terror overtake us, and we started yelling, "Stop following us! You're trespassing, we have guns!" But nothing. It just loomed in the woods, and we couldn't help but feel a piercing stare. We continued to run, and once we neared his house, we turned back again in a fairly large clearing, only a mere 1/3 of a mile from his house or so. But again there it was in the tree line at the end of the clearing. We yelled, "Go away! You're trespassing, we're gonna fire at you!" Childish, but we felt cornered at this point, so my friend fired a warning shot towards it, hoping it would run, or at least flinch. Instead, it almost felt like the world stopped for a moment. Everything felt strange in a way I could best compare to the feeling you have after waking up from the strangest falling dream. It did not move. This was such an unexpected reaction that we turned and ran to his house as fast as we could. Once inside, we hid in his basement playing video games and attempting to pretend like none of it had happened. Many years later, we rounded up a group of friends and hopped on an ATV to return to the structure. We rode the entire length of the stream and found many campsites, but never again did we find that building. It simply was not where it should have been. I don't know how to explain this story, but I know it's kept me up many a night. Has anyone else had this sort of thing happen? Or perhaps an explanation? A couple of years ago, me and some friends had a short-lived phase of trying to go to as many cool abandoned places as we could. One of these was a very old hospital that had been closed down for roughly 20 to 30 years. It was pretty central in a big town, so it was quite regularly maintained in terms of boarding up windows and stuff. Our first visit started with us climbing through a window near the middle of the building. We managed to pry a plywood board up from the window, but as soon as me and my 3 other friends got in that room and opened the door into the main hallway, we all agreed pretty quickly that we shouldn't be there, and left. This is unusual for us, as we clearly weren't scared of much if we were easily able to break and enter into a building in the middle of town. We had also never been scared or anxious of anything before, and it weirded us out to the point that we all agreed to leave immediately. Our second visit is where it got proper weird. We went back around 2 weeks later, and all of the plywood on the windows was replaced with metal sheets, which isn't strange for a building in a large town where people are trying to break in regularly, apart from the fact that the window we went through originally was completely open. We climbed through anyway, and all got the same feelings again, except when we tried to open the door into the hallway. It was locked, and felt as if something was pushed up against it on the other side. We left back through the window, and I was last. and I was about halfway out the window when I heard a young girl laugh pretty much directly behind me in this small room, and I near fell out of the window trying to get away from it. I thought it was just my mind being weird at first, until one of my friends asked if I heard the laugh, and if that's why I jumped through this window. All my other friends heard it too, and said it sounded like it came from that room. All of this is pretty normal stuff, and I'm sure the door being locked and having something behind it was just someone moving stuff around inside, if them and my friends were exploring it too. The young girl's laugh we all heard in the room we were in, and we felt that feeling on both visits. Out back of my own 30-acre property, there is a big grove of eucalyptus trees. I was walking out there to get to the river because me and my friends were going to drink some beer and generally chill by the river. But when we walked by the trees, that I've walked by thousands of times before with no weirdness, I thought I saw a little kid peeking out from one of the bigger trees. So I told my friends to look right there where the kid or whatever it was hiding. And about a 4-foot-tall humanoid thing peeked out with its pale white-like greyish colour. It had a weird head, and honestly that's about as descriptive as I could be. As the moment I saw it, my hair stood up, and I ran as fast as I could back to my house to grab a gun. We still go past those trees to get to the river, but never do so without firearms. I wish I had not been so scared, because I feel like I should have filmed it. I distance hike when I can. Sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes walking in the pitch dark with a low light headlamp gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under our canopy of stars more nights than I can count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, riverbanks, lake shores, ridges, bottoms, bogs and creeks. I've hunted the game, and I'm establishing this because it's important you understand I've heard, seen and smelt about all this region has to offer in way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened at about 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed, that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm in a low bottom that's wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I'm on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. And that's when I heard a loud crack and froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. 4:30 in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instincts though. The thought that something flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself into silence was, if I hear it again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came in a hurry. Why? Because that sound was not just a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant I had to get the hell out of there. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decently sized wooden stick be violently shaken and whacked against a smallish tree. More a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack and not a thud or thump, and I have described it as explosive in the past as it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now, as I stood there completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards. I was going to come to an 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, going away from the creek. This meant, as soon as I got the courage to move towards the noise, I was going to have to turn back to it and get up that ridge, and this made me very nervous. My head somewhere between meth fiend murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts big black moving shadows on the trail, and that didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while going up the trail. And then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter. This was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing, and first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out, and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelt it all, and I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall and especially leafed out branches make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times, but I just don't know what the hell that was. I live in a pretty small and rural town, and most of the neighborhoods are somewhat in the woods. My high school soccer team was having an end-of-the-season party at one of the players' houses in one of these wooded neighborhoods. Towards the end of the night, someone mentioned a house towards the end of the road past a curve, somewhat cut off by woods, that a doctor owned but was never there, leaving it somewhat abandoned. We all thought it would be a good idea to check it out. About 8 or 9 of us walked over there in the pitch darkness, and the house had some small lights, but no one was home. We go to the backyard where there was just a pool and started looking around. Behind the backyard there's only woods, and a little bit of woods on the side as well. It's a big property, so we split up in pairs of 2 or 3, with 2 groups walking around the house and one trying to get inside and on the roof. They weren't that smart. They couldn't get inside or on the roof, so we just sat in the backyard talking about random stuff and joking around, when I noticed a sound that was reminiscent of a clacking sound on the roof. It started sounding like someone was walking back and forth on the roof, and I looked up thinking that someone had made it up, and I see a silhouette of what I thought was one of the kids' faces, but it was pitch black, with bright white eyes. I looked around to see who was missing, but everyone was there. I looked back off the roof, and the sound and the thing were gone. I ignore it, thinking it was just a squirrel or something, and carry on with the conversation. Later, a friend of mine and I decide to talk on one of the sides of the house, and as soon as we crossed the corner, we thought we heard a deer walking through the trees. As we walk closer to get a better look, we hear leaves crunching all around us. We start getting a little spooked and turn around to walk back. When we get closer to the house, we hear leaves crunching right behind us and turn around to see a black stick figure standing not 10 feet away, motionless between the swaying trees, staring at us with those same white eyes I saw on the roof earlier. We both lose our minds and tell everyone we're heading back to the other kid's house. The entire time we're walking off the property and down the driveway, we feel like we're being followed, and still hearing leaves crunching as if someone were right behind us. As soon as we stepped foot off the driveway onto the main road, we felt an instant relief and didn't hear being followed anymore. We didn't turn around once the entire way back, not until we stepped foot onto the other kid's yard. Ever since then, I will occasionally drive by that house, trying to see if I spot what I saw that night. I've only ever seen a pair of white eyes in the woods that one time. The doctor has never returned, and now I think I know why. This is a story relayed to me by my father. Many years ago, he was doing a road trip of the States. He was driving along one night, determined to stay up. He'd been driving for about 5 hours, and it was approaching midnight. Exhaustion and fatigue from the day had been getting to him, and he was starting to feel the strain at the wheel. Every moment was another fight against sleep, and he kept his eyes open, determined to stay awake, for his destination lied only a half hour away. He thought it best to pull over for a brief respite. So he pulled over on the side of the road. It was a fairly desolate place, and there were no other cars. He stopped, looked about, and it was pitch black. The moon was high in the sky, but other than that, it gave very little light for this surrounding area. He got out of his car, reached into his pocket, and fumbled, retrieving a cigarette box, pulled out a cigarette and lit it, while sighing deeply. He really needed to make it that next half hour. As he stood there, thinking about what he was going to do tomorrow, and dreaming about the comfort of a bed for the night, did he hear something in the distance? He turned his head and didn't see anything, and just ignored it, assuming it was the sound of the wind. He finished his cigarette. He stood on the ember, and just as he was about to open the car door, did he look around again. That's when he saw it. The moonlight was reflecting, and there was something in the trees, something vaguely humanoid shape. He tried squinting. Was it a person that needed help? Why were they not approaching? But moreover, why were they standing there creepily in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night? When he realized just how odd this was, did my dad quicken his pace, threw open the car door and closed it, feeling safety within his vehicle. He didn't even do his seatbelt up. He tore us out of there quickly and started making his way to his destination to get some sleep. He looked in his rearview mirror after a few seconds and didn't see anything, and a surge of relief washed over him. As he carried on with his drive, did he occasionally glance in the mirror, and after a few minutes, he noticed it. It was following him. It was matching his speed. He was going at nearly 60 miles an hour. How could this creature be keeping up with him? My father thought he was going mad, but dared not stop to pinch himself and verify this. He put his foot on the accelerator and pumped that machine harder. 70, 80, 90 miles an hour. His car was now really suffering, yet this creature seemed not to stop. Its speed matched the whole time, and as my father was putting his foot further and further, to the point where it wouldn't speed up anymore, he swore he thought the creature was gaining on him. My father was absolutely bricking it. Fear, panic, and terror all consuming him within his mind. His glances back to the mirror were now frequent. His fear was overcoming him. His heart was racing, and he didn't know what to do. And just as quickly as it had started following him, did the creature vanish. It must have run off into a bush or something, or realized my father wasn't worth pursuing. He didn't stop. The speed he maintained, he carried on for several hours. He decided to forget about his little hotel for the night and kept on driving until he reached his friend's place. He passed out when he reached his house about 8 a.m. the next day. The fear fueled him all night, and he told me that he would never visit that part of the States again, and warned me that if I were to find myself down a lonely road in the middle of the night, to keep going and to be wary of my surroundings. Who knows if that creature, whatever it might be, is still out there. How it could reach those speeds, he doesn't know, and he doesn't want to find out. He's just grateful that he got out with his life. Me and my younger sister had this huge open field behind our house. The space was seemingly endless, and we would often spend our summers and vacations exploring all the backfields. These fields went on for a while, and I'd say after about 3 miles led to some decently sized hills. We often would enjoy hiking, just because there was nothing better to do where we lived. When this story occurred, I was only 14 and my sister 11. It was your average Saturday, and we had packed up our picnic, as making it was half the fun, and were going to find a decent spot to eat it at while making our way through the fields. Both my parents had extremely demanding jobs. My mother worked on Saturdays all day pretty much, and my dad had more work to catch up on, so he'd be home plowing away on his laptop while we would go out. There's no cell phone service a little further past our house, so our phones were pretty much useless, but we took them just in case, through some sort of miracle, that we got signal, and in case of an emergency. It was your average day. We'd walked past the fields and gotten to the hills. That's when we went a different route. My sister said that she saw something on the floor, something shiny. We made our way and found a little less traveled path. We'd never come this way. I don't know why, we just never decided to explore this part. She tells me that she wants to go this way, as the shiny thing had brought her luck, and this way was the right way to go. When she showed me what she'd found, it appeared to be a chip, the likes of which you might see inside a phone or a computer. So someone had obviously broken something and scattered whatever electronic device this was all around the woods, which is weird enough. We carried on with our hike, my sister leading, and the path became even more ruggedy as the hills got steeper, going up and down. Part of the fun for me was going to places I didn't know, but something about this hike made me feel uneasy. I wasn't entirely sure what, but my sister seemed happy, so I followed her without complaint. We'd been gone for at least 4 hours now, and as anyone who's hiked knows, 4 hours of walking and hiking will certainly make your stomach grumble. I tell my sister that I'm hungry and to eat the sandwiches and snacks that we had packed. We look around for a decent place to eat, perhaps a log or a rock, but right now there didn't seem to be anything as comfortable. We carried on for approximately 5 minutes before we found a decently sized fallen log that we could comfortably sit on. My sister pulled out the sandwiches and snacks from my backpack, got the drinks, and we started chatting, eating, and generally having a good time. This spot where we had stopped wasn't anything special, but as we spoke, I heard something strange. I asked her to stop munching for a moment, and I heard a sound like the snapping of a twig. I looked frantically in all directions, but was met with nothing. There was a slight echo to the sound too, a reverberance that made me shudder. I looked around again. The sound seemed to be coming from a bit further down, directly below us. We were almost at the crest of a hill, and we couldn't see far down, especially not to where this was. But as we looked down, we could see that it was easy enough to go down and investigate the source of this sound. I was curious, but my sister didn't want to come. She said it sounded scary, like something was biting bones. I laughed at her, told her she was being ridiculous, but had no intention of going off in a hurry as my sandwich was still half eaten, and I had a cereal bar and more snacks to devour before I even thought about moving from my spot. About 20 minutes had passed, and the sound by this point had stopped. I was still curious and begged my sister to come with me. She refused, and so I started making my way round, and when she realized how far I was, did she scream that she was coming too, and chase after me. We make our way down, and this is when we see the opening of a small cave, almost like a crack in the stone of this hillside. We look at each other. I pull out my phone and illuminate with a flashlight the crevice-like space. We inch closer, being very careful to walk quietly as to not spook whatever was making that sound. By this point, I just thought it was an animal, and where we live, we don't have anything dangerous, so I wasn't worried. I was just interested to see what there was. I poke my phone in further, peering, trying as hard as I can to focus in the dark. And as we get closer, I notice that the cave is actually larger than I'd expected. My sister holds my hand in fright as we make our way into the darkness. I flash around, but my phone light isn't very strong and only illuminates a little bit ahead of us. I listen, and there's a rustling in the back. My sister squeaks, the sound frightening her, and tugs on my arm that she wants to leave, but I pull back, and with a look, tell her that I want to keep going. The ground was ordinary, and after a few steps, do we crunch with our feet and look down. There was a small animal bone on the ground. My sister goes, "Ew!" and pulls me again, insisting that we leave. I shine my phone around one more time. This cave is big, and it's not worth upsetting my sister to explore it. Maybe I'll come another day alone, I think to myself. I let her pull me away, and that's when she stops. I heard it too. Something made a sound in the cave. I turn my flashlight in that direction when I see a man stand. He is completely naked, although I couldn't make everything out in high detail, as, like I said, the illumination from my phone isn't the best. We stand there frozen for a second before my sister jolts me and we run. The man just stands there. When we reach the mouth of the cave, which is only wide enough for one person to go through at a time, my heart is thumping out my chest. I push my sister through, and in the moment I have to spare as her butt is going up, I turn around and look at him. He's still standing there from his perch, looking at us. I just about crap myself, scream, and we run for about 20 minutes straight before my sister breaks down crying and scolds me, telling me that we should have never have gone in there. When we get home, fatigued and annoyed at each other, we both rush to tell my dad what happened. I tell him what we saw, and as does my sister, she also saying how important it was to know that it was my idea to go in there in the first place. My dad didn't believe us. He said there's no reason for a man to be hiding in a cave and kind of dismissed us and shooed us away. And that was that. We went to bed that night, sulky that our dad didn't believe us. But the next day in the morning, as we're having breakfast, a police car shows up. The police officer sits us down and asks us a few questions pertaining to what we saw. We give him a vague idea of where this cave was and tell him about the man that was naked and the fact that we'd stepped on bones. He gives me a worried look, says thank you for my help, and is off. It turns out my dad called the police as he was worried and just didn't want to frighten us by believing our story, and admitted to this later that day. A few weeks later, we see on the news that a man has been caught. I didn't know if it was him or not, but they mentioned that he'd been living out in the woods and avoiding police capture for about 3 months. He was wanted for the murder of his mother. I'm so glad that we ran when we did, and I will always regret putting my sister and myself in that danger. Were we close to death? I suppose I'll never know, but I am very glad indeed that we didn't have the opportunity to find out. This happened to me when I was in grade 6, 10 years ago, around September. At recess and lunch, we went outside on nice days. The schoolyard consisted of 2 playgrounds, a soccer field, and a baseball field surrounded by a wooded area. We were not supposed to go into the woods, but there were a few monitors out keeping an eye on 100 or so kids. On this particular day, my friend Courtney was in the woods and came running back, telling me and my other friend Justin to follow her in. A couple of meters in, there sat a tent and a middle-aged man sitting nearby. We're a little freaked out, but the guy immediately explained to us that he was homeless and hungry. Us, thinking we were clever, asked to see his ID to know if we could trust him. I remember his first name was Justin, the same as my friend, and after this we left with the impression that homeless Justin was a nice guy. So the next day we decided to pack some extra snacks for recess to give to homeless Justin. For the next 3 days we brought homeless Justin food and had brief visits with him. We tried to keep him a secret for the other kids, but being so young we weren't so good at hiding that we were sneaking into the woods each recess. On the last day I saw Justin, he told us that these woods weren't big enough, and asked if there were any bigger woods around the area for him to live in. Wanting to help, I explained that there were in fact deep woods near my house, a 5-minute walk away. After school, Courtney and I walked him there, as Courtney lived up at the top of the hill, closer to the woods. So when I got to my house, I left to go home, and for Courtney to bring him up to the top where the path to the woods began. Now this man never actively tried to hurt myself or my friends, but Courtney came and told me the next day at school that the police had found them at the top of the hill and arrested homeless Justin. Courtney and I still aren't sure how they found out what was happening and where they were going. And the next day at school, the principal came into our class extremely angry that we had been foolish enough to help a random dude living in the woods. But our young minds couldn't wrap our head around why. So we decided to Google Justin's name. Turns out local news had published that he had murdered his girlfriend and son and was on the run from police. So random guy living in the woods behind my elementary school, let's not meet again. I went on a midnight walk with my girlfriend. The park by her house has a dirt trail that led up a small mountain. It was about a 30-minute walk to the top, but the view overlooking the city was gorgeous. At the top, the dirt path became paved concrete with a small sitting area. We stayed at the top for about 30 minutes. Upon leaving is where things got creepy. As we started to head back down, at the point where the concrete met dirt path, there was a large pile of trash bags in a crescent shape in the corner of the path's intersection. It was not there when we first arrived. The pile was much too large and in the way for someone who likes to cut corners of paths to notice. My girlfriend remarked at how the shape resembled a dead body and asked me if I had noticed it on the way up. I was very sure that it was not there 30 minutes prior when we arrived. I was extremely sure. Nonetheless, there was no reason to freak my anxiety-prone girlfriend out, so I laughed and said, "Yeah, must have been there, and it was probably trash." Visibility was extremely low, probably about 5 yards, and I didn't want to freak her out, but I was pretty tilted, and I got heckled for being drunk and not listening to her. But in actuality, I was looking and listening for any signs of people around us. In my own head, I was telling myself that I'm just being paranoid, and that it was probably there and I didn't notice it to begin with. But at the same time, I was also sure that it wasn't. I'm sorry I didn't have time to listen to your story about Jesse from work. I'm worried about our safety at the moment. We made it back to our car without running into anyone, but I kind of laughed at myself for being worried about nothing, and also felt the relaxation of my butt muscles that had been clenched for the last half hour. A few days later, the local news covered a dead body found near a park in Anthem at the top of the mountains. Guys, it was actually a dead body. Literally getting chills just saying that. It was actually someone dead. Thank God that my girlfriend didn't watch the news, or she'd have probably shat herself. I lived in the suburbs of a small town in Italy until I was 19. Near my house there was a dirt road that leads into a small wood. I went to the woods with my friends, and a lot of the times when I was a kid, would go there to play and explore. Before entering the woods on the side of the dirt road, there is an unfinished house, and going forward there is a country house built far from the road, accessible via a small path. I first saw the orb when I was 12, and I was going to the woods on my bike with my friends. We opted to stop and explore the unfinished house on the side of the road. So we went inside, but there was nothing interesting, just an empty house which we decided to leave. Before going out of the house, I noticed some stairs that were leading to the first floor. My friends were already on the road, ready to go, except for one of them that was still in the house with me. I asked him to wait for me, as I was going upstairs to see what was there. I was a little scared because the first floor was dark, but I decided to go there anyway. I took 2 steps and saw something on the last step. It was a new bouquet. It looked like someone had brought it the same day and dumped it there. At this point I was very scared and unsure if I should move forward. I took 2 to 3 more steps and I was able to see a room on the right. Inside the room there was the orb, a small white orb with a light floating inside it, but it wasn't a normal LED light. That light wasn't propagating. It wasn't enlightening or anything. It was just contained in this small orb that was stationary. I ran downstairs and outside as soon as I saw it, and never mentioned it to my friends, fearing they wouldn't believe me. As time passed, I forgot about the event. But when I reached 15, I started smoking weed, so I usually went to the woods alone to smoke in peace. Nothing ever happened in the woods, so it didn't scare me, even though the house did. So every time I went to the woods, I ran when I was passing by the house, and then forget about it. But someday I decided to explore the country house. I was high and taking everything very lightly, so I went into the house from the front door. There was another creepy empty house. The windows were open and it wasn't even dark, but one room wasn't like the others. It's the room with the big doors that you can see on the side of the country house. The floors and the walls in the rooms were burnt and totally black. There was a gas tank on the floor with some gasoline still inside it, and on one wall there was a small opening leading to very little and a totally dark room. This little room, perhaps 5 by 1.5 meters, was also burnt, and on the ground there was a pair of children's shoes. Suddenly the fear comes in, but it was nothing compared to the one I felt when I looked outside. In the middle of the countryside between the country house and the abandoned one, there was the same small orb that I'd seen years before. And I've never run so fast in my life. Until a year ago when I was 18, I was hanging out a summer night with my 2 friends. We were bored and opted to go into the woods that night. I started to become very scared and my friends were making fun of me, but I wasn't afraid of the darkness. I was scared of the orb. We parked the car at the end of the paved road and decided to walk the rest of the way. We passed by the abandoned house, and it was there. It was the orb standing in the middle of the countryside. It was the first time I saw it at night, and it was different because it wasn't just a circular light. Behind the light, there was a silhouette of a child. I couldn't see the face or the rest of the body, just a thin white silhouette. And this time my friends saw it too, because we all started to run. I don't live there anymore. I got a high school degree, went to uni in a big city. But if I were there, I would take pictures to show you the house, the burnt room, the shoes, everything. I've had trouble sleeping since then, and the orb has perpetually haunted my dreams. When my sister and I were younger, we used to go to Faxon Park in Quincy and spend hours exploring the woods. Not a lot of woods in a suburban city, so we took advantage of what we had. One day we were pretty deep in there and came upon a clearing. There were a couple of fire rings and 3 trees had been cut down, stripped and propped together to make a tripod. There was a length of frayed rope hanging from the middle. There were some empty booze bottles and trash strewn about, and a few logs arranged like benches. The whole arrangement reminded us of a courtroom. There was nothing overly creepy about this scene at the moment, but we felt a little uneasy knowing that something had gone to the trouble to set all of this up in the middle of the woods. Cut to a week later, I'm reading the local paper, and the front page has a story about a homeless man that was murdered in Faxon Park. Turns out another homeless dude got into an argument with him. A group of them had been drinking in the woods and strung him up by his feet in a makeshift tripod and held their own trial before beating him to death. We had unknowingly stumbled upon the crime scene. To this day, I'm ever so thankful that we didn't find the body. Living in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, I've seen and heard tons of weird stuff. One time, I was walking down the road and found a coyote skull, with the eyes still intact, sitting in the road. It had mostly been stripped by birds at this point, but I'll never forget the eyes. It was April, and my best guess was that it got trapped in the snow that winter, died, and as soon as it started melting, other animals decapitated it, and left it in the road. Now, I've had some stuff happen to me that I can't explain. I was walking on a seldom used abandoned settlement trail in the early spring, when the least amount of hikers around. I was 17 at the time. As I headed up the trail, I could hear a distinct humming in the woods, a little bit away from me. It sounded like a woman, but no one should have been out there at the time. It's a trail that's rarely ever used in the summertime, when people are out and about in the woods. It also, at first, seemed far enough away that whoever it was couldn't see me, making the chances of it being someone messing with me almost zero. For a while I kept walking, telling myself it was something natural, like a stream of water running against the snow and rocks. But every time I stopped, it stopped too. When I would continue on, it would get louder. I got a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach and turned on my heel back the way I came towards my car. I think I was probably a half-mile in at this point, and something in my brain told me to run, and I took off, even though the snow was pretty difficult to move quickly through. I swear something was running along beside me in the woods, keeping pace, but I was too afraid to even glance at the tree line. I got into my car as quickly as possible and stared back at the trail. I didn't see anything, but I felt like something was watching me, and I got out of there fast. This story has been passed down through my family. They called it the Indian's Devil. All I know is that my great-great-great-grandfather was courting his wife and had to walk 12 miles up the old island road. The story goes that something jumped out of the trees at him. It had the hands and feet and face of a man, but the body of an ape. It followed him for miles, mocking him and then running away. The local Aboriginal people call it a devil and always told their children to stay close or it might snatch them. They knew this thing, so I asked Grampy what happened, and he said that my great-great-great-grandpa was so upset that he took to his bed for 4 days. He then got a bunch of men together and they tracked it down and shot it. We live in New Jersey, and if you're familiar with the magazine Weird and Jay, then you'll know all about Clinton Road. For those of you who don't, Clinton Road is a road in West Milford, New Jersey, that's 10 miles of pure dark and winding of road in the middle of the woods, with no streetlights and no houses the entire way. It's considered the most haunted road in America and is a popular spot for teens and young adults to look for a scare. Popular urban legends of the area are ghosts, satanic rituals, and KKK gatherings in the woods, hybrid animals, and a spot where mafia hitman Richard Iceman Kuklinski would dump his bodies. So my friend and I took a trip there one time, and he's driving down the road and he swears he saw a fat guy with his face covered in face paint or makeup in his underwear, walking on the side of the road. Another time he said he found a red phone booth just like the ones in Britain, if not an exact replica, with an ominous purple or dark blue light shining from it.